I handed my ambitious son $15,000 in cash to save my mute granddaughter's voice. Instead, he used my life savings to buy his wife a luxury SUV and threw the little girl away like garbage. They thought my stiff joints and old age meant I was too weak to fight back. They were wrong. I spent 2 agonizing years learning American Sign Language just to find her in the dark system they trapped her in. When her tiny hands finally signed the truth back to me, the storm I brought down on them was absolute. My name is Clifton. I am 69 years old, and before I tell you exactly how I dismantled my own son's life to save a little girl, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe true family is about sacrifice, not just blood. The harsh fluorescent light of the local bank illuminated the paper statement in my trembling hands. I stared at the bold black ink displaying a 0 balance in my savings account. That $15,000 was not just money. It represented 40 years of breathing toxic fumes and lifting heavy iron at the Pittsburgh steel mill. Every single dollar in that account was earned with sweat, agonizing backaches, and joints that now burned with severe arthritis every time the weather turned cold. I had withdrawn the entire sum last month and handed it directly to my son Dayon. The money had one specific non-negotiable purpose. It was to pay for an intensive specialized speech therapy program for my 7-year-old granddaughter Aaliyah. Aaliyah was born deaf and mute, a brilliant but silent little girl who desperately needed advanced educational support that her parents constantly claimed they could not afford. I had sacrificed my own retirement comfort without a single second thought to give her a chance at a normal life. But the bank manager had just confirmed that the cashier's check was never deposited into any medical facility or educational institution. It was cashed out directly at a luxury auto dealership across town. My arthritic knees ached terribly as I walked out of the bank and climbed into my beat-up pickup truck. A cold dread settled deep in my stomach. I turned the ignition and drove straight to the upscale suburban neighborhood where Dion and his wife Heather lived. I pulled up to their perfectly manicured lawn and my blood instantly boiled. There, gleaming arrogantly under the afternoon sun in their wide concrete driveway, sat a brand new metallic black luxury SUV. Heather was standing right in front of it wearing expensive designer sunglasses and holding her phone up high. She was taking selfies, posing against the shiny hood of the vehicle with a smug, victorious smile on her pale face. I slammed my heavy truck door shut and marched up the driveway. The heavy thud of my steel-toed work boots on the pavement made her turn around. She lowered her phone immediately, rolling her eyes as if my mere presence was an ugly stain on her perfect afternoon. "Where is the money for the therapy program, Heather?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm. She crossed her arms and leaned comfortably against the expensive leather seats of the open driver's side door. She let out a short, dismissive laugh that made my stomach turn. "Are you blind, Clifton?" she replied, tapping the polished roof of the car with her manicured fingernails. "You are looking right at it. I needed a safer, more reliable vehicle to navigate these suburbs. You certainly cannot expect me to drive around in a basic, embarrassing sedan anymore." My chest tightened with a rage I had never felt before. That money was specifically for Aaliyah, I stated, stepping closer to her. "I gave Dion those funds for the medical center. You stole from a disabled child. You stole from your own daughter to buy a toy." Heather did not even flinch. She simply smirked and adjusted her sunglasses. "Oh, please do not be so dramatic," she sneered. "Dion and I are her parents. We decide what is best for the family finances. Throwing thousands of dollars at a kid who cannot even say hello is a terrible return on investment. We needed something practical for the family image." The sheer unfiltered cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow to the ribs. I reached out and grabbed the edge of the car door, demanding that she call Dion outside immediately so I could speak to him face to face. She swatted my hand away in absolute disgust, warning me loudly not to scratch the pristine paint with my rough working-class hands. I raised my voice, demanding to know where Aaliyah was right now. The heavy front door of the large house swung open. Dion stepped out onto the porch wearing a crisp, expensive custom suit, looking incredibly irritated by the noise on his property. Dion walked down the porch steps and deliberately placed himself firmly between Heather and me. He did not look ashamed. He looked profoundly annoyed. I stared at the boy I had raised entirely by myself after his mother passed away, desperately searching for any trace of the good man I thought he had become. "Dad, lower your voice right now," Dion commanded, glancing nervously at the surrounding houses to see if the neighbors were watching. "You are causing a scene and embarrassing us." "You took her voice away, Dion." I fired back, pointing a shaking finger directly at his chest. You took the money for her school and bought a car for your wife. How could you look your own daughter in the eye after doing something so vile?" Dion sighed deeply, running a hand over his face as if I were simply a nuisance he had to manage. He looked at me with cold, completely detached eyes. "Listen to me carefully, Dad," he said in a smooth, calculated tone. "Aaliyah is a defective product. The specialist said her progress would be incredibly slow if she ever made any real progress at all. Heather and I are young. We have a whole life ahead of us, and we are not going to bankrupt our future pouring limited resources into a bottomless pit. The therapy was a complete waste of money. This new SUV actually serves this family." I felt the ground literally shift beneath my feet. I could not comprehend the monster standing in front of me wearing my son's face. Defective product. I repeated the horrific words, tasting like bitter ash in my mouth. "She is your own flesh and blood. She is an innocent little girl who needs her father." Dion shook his head, a cruel, arrogant smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Actually, we have brand new priorities now," he stated proudly. He reached out and placed a gentle hand on Heather's stomach. "Heather gave birth 2 days ago. We have a new baby boy, a healthy, completely normal, perfect boy who will actually be able to speak to us and make us proud. We simply cannot have Aaliyah draining the financial resources and time that he rightfully deserves." I was entirely paralyzed by the sudden revelation. They had a new child and intentionally kept it a secret from me. Before my mind could fully process the depth of their betrayal, Dion stepped forward and shoved me hard in the chest, forcing me to stumble backward clumsily toward the street. "Get off my property right now, old man," Dion spat, his voice devoid of any warmth or history. "You do not belong here anymore, and we are absolutely done listening to your outdated lectures about morality." He grabbed Heather's arm tightly, pulling her quickly toward the house. They walked inside together without looking back and slammed the heavy oak door. The deadbolt clicked loudly, echoing across the quiet street, effectively locking me out of their lives. I stood entirely alone in the driveway, my heart pounding violently against my ribs, the cold autumn wind biting through my thin jacket. I did not know it at that exact moment, but their cruel dismissal was just the beginning. They had already set a far more sinister plan in motion, one that would force me to tear their entire world apart to save the granddaughter they threw away. 7 agonizing days passed since that heavy oak door slammed in my face. 7 days of a suffocating silence that made my arthritic bones ache worse than any freezing winter shift at the mill. Every time I closed my eyes, the cold, detached look in my son's eyes haunted me. It simply did not make sense. I raised Dion entirely single-handedly after his mother passed away from a sudden, aggressive stroke when he was just 9 years old. I worked grueling double shifts in the sweltering heat of the factory, cooked every single meal we ate, and sat at his parent-teacher conferences with heavy steel dust still clinging to my collar. I sacrificed my own youth to ensure he had a future. We survived that crushing grief together, building a bond I thought was unbreakable. I trusted him blindly because he was my only flesh and blood, the living legacy of the woman I loved. But a deep, agonizing knot in my stomach told me something was terribly wrong. Aaliyah had missed her scheduled weekend visit, and Dion was sending all my phone calls straight to an automated voicemail. By Tuesday morning, the agonizing suspense became completely unbearable. My protective instincts took over entirely. I grabbed my worn keys, ignored the sharp, familiar pain shooting through my knees, and drove my heavy truck back out to their upscale suburban neighborhood, absolutely determined to demand the truth. I turned the corner onto their pristine tree-lined street and hit the brakes so hard the heavy tires squealed violently against the pavement. My heart dropped entirely into my stomach. The brand-new luxury SUV Heather had been posing with was completely gone. Dion's sports car was nowhere to be seen. But the most terrifying sight was the oversized, brightly colored for sale sign jammed aggressively into the center of the perfectly manicured front lawn. I threw the truck into park and scrambled out entirely, ignoring the burning sensation in my joints. I ran up the wide concrete driveway and cupped my rough hands against the large front window to block the sun. The massive living room was entirely stripped bare. There were no expensive leather sofas, no massive television screen, no framed family photographs hanging on the freshly painted walls. The house was a hollow, echoing shell. They had packed up their entire lives and vanished without a single word. I pounded my heavy fist violently against the thick front door, the desperate sound echoing hollowly down the quiet, wealthy street, but I knew deep down nobody was inside. They had run away. "They are gone, Clifton," a quiet voice called out from the sidewalk behind me. I spun around quickly to see Mrs. Higgins, the elderly neighbor from across the street, tightly gripping the leather leash of her golden retriever. She looked at me with a sickening mixture of deep pity and severe discomfort. She explained that massive moving trucks came 3 days ago and cleaned the entire property out in a matter of hours. I rushed down the front steps, my chest heaving heavily as I struggled to pull oxygen into my lungs. I demanded to know where they went, and most importantly, where Aaliyah was. Mrs. Higgins shifted her weight nervously, looking firmly down at her shoes. She admitted she did not know where Dion and Heather relocated. But then she dropped a revelation that made my blood run entirely cold. She said the little girl did not go with them. A freezing chill shot violently up my spine, paralyzing my vocal cords. I demanded to know what she meant. She pulled her dog closer and whispered that the night before the moving trucks arrived around 2 in the morning, a large white passenger van pulled up to the curb. It had official state government license plates. 2 people wearing dark uniforms walked inside and brought Aaliyah out into the freezing night air. She was wrapped tightly in a thin blanket, crying silently, her tiny shoulders shaking. They strapped her into the back of the dark van and drove away into the night. The world violently tilted on its axis. My vision blurred completely at the edges as pure, unadulterated panic flooded my veins. A state transport van. 2 in the morning. My beautiful, innocent, silent granddaughter handed over to complete strangers in the dead of night like a piece of stolen property. I did not even bother saying goodbye or thank you to the neighbor. I sprinted back to my truck with a speed I had not possessed in 20 years, my heavy steel-toed boots slamming against the pavement. I shoved the key fiercely into the ignition, the old engine roaring to life as I slammed my foot down hard on the gas pedal. I broke every single speed limit between the quiet suburbs and the downtown police precinct. My mind raced frantically through 100 horrifying scenarios. Had they sold her to cover hidden debts? Had they abandoned her in some remote facility to cover up a terrible accident? They had already stolen her voice, and now they had stolen her physical presence completely. I parked the truck diagonally across 2 designated parking spots right outside the local police station and practically tore the heavy glass doors off their metal hinges as I stormed inside the building. I marched directly up to the elevated front desk, my calloused hands slamming flat against the thick bulletproof glass. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man with dark, tired eyes, looked up sharply from his computer screen. I leaned closer to the glass and declared loudly that I needed to report a kidnapping immediately. I explained frantically that my wealthy son and his wife had completely disappeared, and they had handed my disabled granddaughter over to unknown strangers in a white van in the middle of the night. I gave him her name, her age, and explained her medical condition, begging him to send units out to find her before it was too late. The sergeant frowned deeply, instantly sensing the raw gravity of the situation. He asked for Dion's full legal name and began typing rapidly into the federal law enforcement database. The loud, rhythmic clicking of his keyboard sounded like a ticking time bomb in the quiet station lobby. After a torturous, agonizing minute, he stopped typing abruptly. He leaned back in his chair, let out a heavy sigh, and looked at me with an expression that made my heart stop beating completely. "Clifton," the sergeant said slowly, his tone shifting from urgent concern to strictly official protocol. "This is not a kidnapping case. Your son and daughter-in-law legally surrendered Aaliyah to the State Department of Child and Family Services 4 days ago. They filed an absolute permanent relinquishment of all parental rights, legally classifying the child as an unmanageable medical burden that they could no longer financially or emotionally support." I stumbled backward, aggressively shaking my head in total denial. I told him that was impossible and demanded he tell me where she was so I could go take custody of her myself right now. The sergeant held up his hand firmly, his eyes hardening with warning. He told me I could not do that. He explained that along with the state surrender documents, Dion had preemptively filed an emergency restraining order against me with a family court judge. I was now legally barred from coming within 500 feet of him, his wife, and any state or federal facility holding that child. Aaliyah was officially a ward of the state, now locked away in the system, and as far as the law was concerned, I was classified as a hostile, dangerous threat. Aaliyah was gone, swallowed entirely by a cold, merciless bureaucracy, and my own flesh and blood had carefully engineered the paperwork to ensure I was completely powerless to save her. The engine of my old truck ticked loudly as it cooled down in the bleak parking lot of the State Child Protective Services building. I sat alone behind the steering wheel, staring blankly at the thick stack of legal papers the police desk sergeant had reluctantly printed out for me earlier that morning. The emergency restraining order was an absolute masterpiece of legal fiction. Dion and Heather had carefully crafted a document that described me as a violent, mentally unstable man who posed a direct physical threat to my own family. It legally barred me from any contact with them, but far more importantly, it deliberately and ruthlessly severed any legal standing I had as Aaliyah's grandfather. My hands, heavily scarred and permanently calloused from decades of pouring molten steel, trembled with a silent fury as I gripped the steering wheel. The system was clearly never designed to protect the innocent or the vulnerable. It was designed to protect the wealthy people who knew exactly how to manipulate the paperwork. I looked up at the towering, windowless concrete building standing ominously in front of me. Behind those thick walls was a massive, heartless maze of state bureaucracy, and somewhere deeply buried inside that maze, my silent 7-year-old granddaughter was trapped completely alone. I folded the heavy court papers, shoved them aggressively into my heavy coat pocket, and forced myself to step out of the truck. My knees burned with arthritis in the damp air, but I was absolutely not going to let a fabricated piece of paper dictate the fate of the only pure thing left in my family. The fluorescent lights inside the CPS waiting room hummed with a depressing, sterile energy that made my head throb. After waiting 4 grueling hours on a hard-cracked plastic chair, listening to the hopeless cries of broken families all around me, my name was finally called over a crackling intercom. A tired security guard directed me into a cramped, windowless office smelling strongly of stale black coffee and old paper. Behind a large metal desk sat a state caseworker whose nameplate read, Mr. Davies. He looked profoundly exhausted, his dark eyes carrying the heavy, detached weight of a man who handled entirely too many broken lives and cared far too little about the individual details of any of them. I sat down heavily in the chair opposite him and immediately started pleading my case. I kept my voice incredibly calm and respectful, knowing any display of anger would immediately be used against me. I explained everything clearly. I told him about the $15,000 Dion stole for the luxury SUV, the sudden move under the cover of darkness, and the undeniable fact that Aaliyah was completely mute and deaf. I stressed that she was utterly unable to advocate for herself or call for help in whatever facility they had dumped her in. I begged him to just tell me what city or county she was currently located in so I could hire a proper family lawyer to fight for legal custody. Mr. Davies barely even lifted his head from his computer monitor as I spoke. He lazily typed my legal name and Aaliyah's name into his state database. The moment his finger hit the enter key, a harsh red warning banner must have flashed aggressively across his screen because his entire physical posture changed instantly. He sat back sharply, crossed his arms over his chest, and let out a long, tired sigh. "I cannot help you today, Mr. Clifton," he said flatly, his voice entirely devoid of any human empathy. "The state system clearly indicates an active, severe restraining order against you filed by the biological parents. Furthermore, they officially executed a voluntary, permanent surrender of parental rights, specifically citing severe medical complications. The child is now officially classified as a ward of the state." I leaned forward immediately, my knuckles turning completely white as I gripped the sharp edge of his metal desk. I told him firmly that they did not surrender her for medical reasons. They abandoned her out of pure greed and cruelty so they could focus on their new baby. Mr. Davies shook his head slowly, looking at me as if I were a nuisance. "It does not matter what you believe their personal motives were," he replied coldly. "By state law, you have absolutely zero custodial rights. You are legally classified as a hostile third party. If I give you any information whatsoever regarding the current physical location of that child, I would be committing a federal crime, violating a direct judge order, and losing my pension. I am asking you to stand up and leave my office right now before I call building security and have you arrested for violating the proximity terms of your active restraining order." The absolute finality in his dead eyes was like a heavy steel door violently slamming shut right in my face. The legal system had successfully built an impenetrable brick wall around my granddaughter, and they fully expected an old, tired steelworker to just walk away and let her disappear into the void. I did not argue with him. I stood up silently, turned my back, and walked out of that suffocating government building. I realized right then that playing by their rigged rules was a guaranteed death sentence for Aaliyah. If the state insisted on hiding her behind an unbreakable firewall of red tape and legal threats, I was going to have to tear that firewall down myself using methods they could never track. I drove my truck straight back to my local bank branch on the industrial side of town. I did not bother checking my empty savings account this time. Instead, I walked directly to the secure safety deposit box in the back concrete vault. Inside, a small metal tin was a single physical government bond worth exactly $8,000. It was my absolute last financial safety net. It was the emergency money I had carefully set aside over 20 years for my own funeral expenses, so I would never be a financial burden to anyone when my heart finally gave out. I cashed it out on the spot without a single moment of hesitation and walked out of the bank with a thick paper envelope stuffed with untraceable $100 bills. I knew exactly who I needed to call. During my 40 years sweating at the mill, you meet people who operate entirely outside the boundaries of polite society. I drove to a dimly lit, rundown diner situated near the old shipping shipyards to meet a man named Silas. Silas was a disgraced former police detective who lost his official badge a decade ago due to corruption, but he managed to keep all his backdoor access to the highly classified federal and state databases. He operated strictly in the shadows, asking zero moral questions, as long as the cash was green and untraceable. I slid the thick envelope of funeral money across the sticky diner table along with the names, the birth dates, and a detailed description of Aaliyah's medical condition. Silas counted the heavy stack of money, quickly tucked it deeply into the inside pocket of his worn leather jacket, and promised me he would find exactly where the state buried her before the sun came up. I drove home and sat in my dark, empty living room for 7 excruciating hours, watching the second hand sweep across the wall clock. Just past midnight, my prepaid burner phone buzzed loudly on the coffee table. It was Silas. When I answered, his voice lacked its usual arrogant, confident edge. He actually sounded uncharacteristically grim. He told me he successfully cracked the state placement database, but the news was far worse than I could have ever prepared myself for. The state did not place Aaliyah in a traditional foster home with a loving family. Because of her severe communication disabilities and the medical burden classification, Dion filed the overwhelmed system fast-tracked her directly into a specialized private facility contracted by the government. Silas told me she was routed to a massive compound called Oak Ridge Private Care. My blood ran completely cold as Silas explained what Oak Ridge really was. It was not a hospital, and it was certainly not a school. It was a notoriously corrupt for-profit holding facility hidden deep in the woods of the neighboring county. Silas had pulled their quiet, redacted rap sheet. They were infamous among local underground law enforcement for heavily medicating disabled and nonverbal children with extreme chemical sedatives just to keep them quiet and easily compliant. They operated with absolutely minimal state oversight, essentially functioning as a dark, profitable warehouse for the broken children society wanted to forget. My completely defenseless, silent granddaughter was not just lost in the system. She was locked away inside a living nightmare, and I had to find a way inside that fortress before they broke her beautiful spirit forever. The terrifying reality of Oak Ridge Private Care forced me to bypass the hostile caseworkers entirely and take my fight straight to the county courthouse. Armed with the backdoor intelligence Silas provided, I filed a desperate pro se petition for emergency medical visitation rights invoking my status as a biological grandparent. I stood before a stern family court judge who looked at me over the rim of her glasses with deep skepticism. She had the fabricated restraining order sitting right on top of her desk. She told me frankly that under normal circumstances, I would be arrested just for standing in her courtroom. However, she noted a tiny, obscure loophole in the state welfare code. Because Aaliyah was officially classified as a nonverbal ward with profound communication barriers, the state was legally obligated to allow contact with anyone who could serve as an essential medical communicator. The judge looked at my thick, calloused hands and issued a brutal ultimatum. She would grant me a single, highly restricted visit to Oak Ridge, but only if I could pass an official, rigorous state evaluation proving I was absolutely fluent in American Sign Language. If I failed the test, the petition would be permanently dismissed. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over me. During my 40 years manipulating molten steel bars and operating vibrating heavy machinery at the plant, my hands had been essentially destroyed. My knuckles were massive and swollen with severe osteoarthritis. My fingers were stiff, scarred hooks that could barely grip a coffee mug without sending sharp electric nerve pain shooting straight up to my elbows. Moving my fingers with any kind of delicate precision was pure agonizing torture. But I looked the judge directly in the eye and agreed to her terms without a single second of hesitation. I had exactly 3 weeks until the scheduled court evaluation. What followed was a grueling, torturous marathon of physical and mental endurance that pushed my aging body far past its breaking point. I bought thick, heavy American Sign Language textbooks from a local community college and spent hours watching video tutorials on my small mobile phone. Day 1 was an absolute disaster. I could barely form the basic letters of the alphabet. forcing my stiff arthritic fingers to bend into the rigid complex shapes required by the language felt like driving rusty nails directly into my joints. The pain was so intense it brought hot, involuntary tears to my eyes. My hands shook violently and my forearms cramped until the muscles completely locked up. But every single time the agony made me want to stop, I pictured Aaliyah sitting alone in a dark, heavily medicated room at Oak Ridge. That horrifying image became fuel. I refused to let my physical limitations fail that little girl. I instituted a punishing, relentless daily routine. Every morning before the sun came up, I filled 2 plastic buckets with freezing water and solid blocks of ice. I submerged my hands into the freezing water until the severe inflammation numbed entirely and my skin turned a pale, sickly blue. Once the joints were numb, I quickly dried them off and wrapped my knuckles tightly in heavy athletic tape, physically forcing my crooked fingers into the correct alignments. I sat in front of the cracked mirror in my hallway for 18 hours a day, practicing thousands of different signs. I practiced the subtle syntax, the necessary facial expressions, and the rapid hand transitions. When the numbing effect of the ice wore off, the burning pain returned with a vengeance, radiating through my bones like fire. My knuckles bled from the friction of the tight bandages. I consumed dangerous amounts of over-the-counter painkillers just to keep my hands moving. When I finally collapsed into bed for a few hours of sleep, my hands throbbed relentlessly against the mattress, keeping me awake. But in the quiet darkness of my house, my signing became faster. It became sharper. It became unmistakable. I was no longer a retired steelworker trying to learn a language. I was a desperate grandfather forging a weapon out of thin air. On the morning of the state evaluation, I sat in a sterile courtroom annex across from an official, highly credentialed state ASL evaluator. Before she walked into the room, I carefully peeled the bloody athletic tape off my hands and shoved my hands deep into my coat pockets. I could not let her see the physical damage, or she might fail me on medical grounds. The evaluator sat down, opened her file, and began to rapid-fire complex, multi-layered sentences at me using only her hands. She tested my vocabulary regarding medical terms, emotional distress, and legal rights. I swallowed the raw, biting pain in my joints and matched her pace perfectly. I caught every single subtle movement she made and signed back with flawless, fluid grammar. I did not flinch. I did not hesitate. I poured every ounce of my love and rage into my hands. After 20 intense minutes, the evaluator stopped. She looked genuinely shocked by the absolute proficiency of the rough, elderly man sitting across from her. She reached for her pen and firmly stamped the official approval seal directly onto my court documents. I marched those documents straight back into the family court. The judge reviewed the stamped evaluation and let out a long, defeated sigh. Bound by the strict letter of the law, she was forced to grant me a temporary emergency visitation order. It was heavily restricted. I was granted exactly 15 minutes. The visit had to be strictly supervised by Oak Ridge medical staff at all times, and I was forbidden from asking the child any questions about her parents. It was a tiny, microscopic window of opportunity, but it was all I needed to breach the walls of their fortress. The Oak Ridge private care facility looked more like a medium-security prison than a medical sanctuary. It was a bleak, sprawling concrete compound surrounded by high chain-link fences situated miles away from the main highway. The clinical smell of heavy bleach and cheap institutional food hit my nose the second I walked through the metal detector at the front entrance. A hostile, burly security guard escorted me down a long, dimly lit corridor into a sterile visiting room that contained nothing but a single plastic table and 2 bolted chairs. A heavy metal door on the opposite side of the room buzzed loudly. An orderly wearing blue scrubs pushed the door open and guided Aaliyah into the room. My heart completely shattered inside my chest. She looked absolutely terrible. Her beautiful face was pale and entirely hollowed out. Her eyes sunken with heavy, dark circles. But the most horrifying detail was the dark purple bruises marring her fragile arms, peeking out from beneath her oversized gray facility shirt. My hands trembled, but I forced a warm, loving smile onto my face. I raised my painful hands and signed a beautiful, desperate greeting telling her how much I loved her and how hard I had fought to find her. Aaliyah stopped walking. She looked directly at my hands, but her eyes were completely dead. They held no warmth, no relief, no spark of recognition. She did not raise her tiny hands to respond. Instead, she deliberately turned her entire body away from me and faced the blank cinder block wall. The realization hit me like a devastating physical blow to the stomach. Dion and Heather had not just abandoned her, They had convinced this innocent little girl that I was the one who threw her away. She believed I had broken my promise to protect her. She absolutely hated me, and my 15 minutes were rapidly ticking away. The heavy metal clock on the cinder block wall ticked away my precious seconds. I stepped to the side, desperately trying to bring myself back into her line of sight. I kept my stiff hands moving, signing simple words of comfort, promising her that I was here to take her home. But as I leaned closer, the harsh fluorescent lighting revealed a terrifying truth. Her refusal to look at me was not just born of anger or betrayal. Her tiny shoulders were slumped forward at an unnatural, lifeless angle. Her breathing was dangerously shallow and completely out of rhythm. I crouched down to meet her eye level, and a cold wave of horror washed over me. Aaliyah's dark brown eyes, usually so bright and remarkably observant, were entirely glassy and unfocused. Her pupils were dilated so widely that they nearly swallowed her irises. A tiny line of drool slipped from the corner of her mouth, and she did not even possess the basic motor function to wipe it away. She was not just giving me the silent treatment, she was heavily, dangerously medicated. The stories Silas had told me about Oak Ridge were not just terrifying rumors, they were chemically erasing my granddaughter right in front of my eyes. Before I could even fully process the depth of their chemical abuse, the heavy metal door buzzed again. A tall woman wearing a pristine white nurse uniform stepped into the visiting room. She carried a small plastic tray holding a single paper cup filled with apple juice. She wore a tight, practiced smile that did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. She announced loudly that it was time for Aaliyah to take her afternoon hydration. I watched the nurse closely as she approached the plastic table. 40 years of monitoring microscopic cracks in moving steel at the factory had given me incredibly sharp peripheral vision. I saw the subtle, practiced flick of her wrist. I saw her thumb slide a heavy liquid dropper from the inside of her uniform sleeve and expertly squeeze a thick, cloudy substance directly into the apple juice. She was actively dosing a 7-year-old child right in front of me, ensuring Aaliyah would remain completely docile and severely unresponsive for the remainder of my court-mandated visit. A primal, uncontrollable rage erupted from the deepest part of my soul. I did not care about the strict visitation rules or the fragile state of my arthritic joints. The adrenaline entirely masked my physical pain. I lunged forward with a sudden speed that startled the nurse entirely. I swung my heavy, calloused hand across the table and violently slapped the plastic cup out of her grip. The cup hit the cinder block wall with a loud smack, splashing the chemically tainted apple juice across the sterile white floor. The thick sedative began to eat through the cheap floor wax immediately. The nurse shrieked loudly, stumbling backward and clutching her chest in feigned terror. I stepped firmly between her and Aaliyah, using my large frame as an impenetrable physical shield. I pointed a shaking finger directly at the spilled liquid and demanded in a roaring voice to know exactly what heavy narcotics she was illegally pumping into my granddaughter's veins. The nurse frantically reached for the emergency panic button on the wall, screaming at the top of her lungs that I had violently attacked her. I slammed both of my heavy hands onto the plastic table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cramped room. I demanded that she bring the facility director and the head medical doctor into this room immediately. I promised her I was going to have the state medical board tear this corrupt fortress apart brick by brick until every single staff member was sitting in a federal prison cell. The piercing wail of the security alarm instantly shattered the air. Within seconds, heavy combat boots thundered down the hallway. 3 massive security guards wearing dark tactical vests burst through the visiting room door. They did not ask a single question or attempt to de-escalate the situation. 2 of them aggressively grabbed my shoulders while the third violently kicked my legs out from under me. I hit the hard concrete floor with a sickening thud that rattled my teeth. They forcefully yanked my arms behind my back, twisting my severely arthritic joints so hard I tasted blood in my mouth from biting my own tongue just to keep from screaming. Through the blinding haze of physical pain, I saw Aaliyah briefly look down at me. For a fraction of a second, the heavy chemical fog lifted from her eyes, replaced entirely by pure raw terror as she watched me being brutalized. Then a 4th man entered the room. He wore an expensive tailored suit completely out of place in a state-funded medical facility. He introduced himself coldly as Dr. Vance, the primary facility director of Oak Ridge. He looked down at me, pinned against the cold floor, with an expression of supreme, absolute arrogance. He turned to the shaking nurse and asked if I had physically assaulted her. She nodded vigorously, pointing a trembling finger at the spilled juice and claiming I tried to strike her face. Dr. Vance pulled a small black radio from his leather belt. He officially documented my actions over the radio as a severe, unprovoked physical assault on essential medical staff. He looked directly into my eyes and delivered his final, devastating verdict. He stated that my court-ordered visitation rights were permanently revoked, effective immediately. He ordered the heavy guards to drag me out of the building and warned me clearly that if I ever set foot on Oak Ridge property again, I would be shot on sight for criminal trespassing. The guards hauled me roughly to my feet and dragged me down the long, bleak corridor, throwing me violently out the front glass doors onto the freezing pavement. I drove my old truck back to the city with my ribs aching deeply and my knuckles bleeding onto the worn steering wheel. The sun was setting quickly, casting long, dark shadows over my quiet, empty neighborhood. Every breath I took sent a sharp pain through my chest, but the physical agony was absolutely nothing compared to the crushing defeat in my heart. I had failed her. I had lost my temper and handed the enemy the exact excuse they needed to lock me out forever. As I walked heavily up the wooden steps to my front porch, I noticed a thick, crisp white envelope securely taped directly to my front door. It had no return address, but the heavy paper stock screamed expensive corporate law. I ripped it open under the dim yellow porch light. It was a formal legal threat drafted by Dion's high-priced attorneys. The letter was brutally clear and highly specific. It demanded that I completely drop my independent investigation into Oak Ridge Private Care immediately. If I refused to comply, they promised to press federal criminal assault charges regarding the fabricated incident with the nurse today, and they would systematically seize my entire steelworker pension to cover their ridiculous legal damages. I stared at the letter as the cold autumn wind whipped around me. A sudden piercing realization cut entirely through my physical pain and mental exhaustion. The logic simply did not align. Dion and Heather had legally abandoned Aaliyah to the state system specifically to rid themselves of a financial burden. So why on earth were they spending thousands of dollars on elite corporate lawyers to aggressively protect the very state facility they dumped her in? They did not care about her well-being. They had completely written her off to focus on their new baby. Unless Oak Ridge was not just a random state placement. Unless Oak Ridge was actively protecting something incredibly valuable for them. They only cared about money. Which meant Aaliyah was not just a discarded child. She was the absolute center of a massive hidden financial conspiracy, and Oak Ridge was holding her hostage for them until the payout was ready. The crisp, expensive paper of the legal threat trembled slightly in my swollen hands, but not from fear. A profound, icy calm washed over my entire body, completely extinguishing the desperate panic that had been suffocating me for weeks. Dion and Heather had just made a catastrophic, arrogant mistake. Wealthy, greedy people do not spend thousands of dollars on elite corporate attorneys to protect a child they genuinely view as a worthless burden. They only deploy those kinds of expensive, aggressive legal weapons when a massive financial asset is actively threatened. The threat of seizing my modest steelworker pension was meant to bury me in fear, but instead it handed me a glowing map in the dark. I walked inside my quiet house, locked the heavy front door, and immediately picked up my prepaid burner phone. I dialed the encrypted number for Silas. When he answered, his voice was thick with sleep, but I did not apologize for waking him. I told him about the violent confrontation at Oak Ridge, the heavy chemical sedatives they were pumping into my granddaughter, and the sudden, highly suspicious legal threat I had just received from Dion's lawyers. I told Silas that Aaliyah was not simply a discarded child caught in a broken system. She was the absolute center of a hidden financial conspiracy, and I needed him to tear into Heather's family history until he found the exact dollar amount they were hiding. Silas warned me that digging into sealed corporate accounts and elite family trusts was a highly dangerous game that attracted federal attention. I told him I did not care if it brought down the entire federal government. I promised him every single remaining dollar of my cashed-out funeral bond. Silas sighed heavily through the phone, the sound of a match striking a cigarette echoing through the receiver. He told me to come to his apartment immediately. I drove across town to a decaying industrial neighborhood and climbed 3 flights of dark stairs to Silas's apartment. His living room looked like a chaotic electronic bunker. Heavy blackout curtains covered the windows, and the entire space was illuminated by the harsh blue light of 6 massive computer monitors sitting on a reinforced metal desk. Silas was rapidly typing lines of complex code across 3 different screens, his cigarette burning low in an ashtray. I pulled up a broken folding chair and sat beside him. I told him to completely ignore Dion's financial history. Dion was just a greedy opportunist who married into money. I instructed Silas to focus entirely on Heather's family. Heather constantly projected the image of an independent, self-made woman, heavily implying her family had gone completely bankrupt years ago. I knew that was a carefully constructed lie. Silas cracked his knuckles and began diving deep into the sealed probate records of Heather's late father, a ruthless real estate developer who had passed away unexpectedly 5 years ago. For 4 agonizing hours, I sat in the dim, smoke-filled room watching Silas navigate through an incredibly complex, intentionally confusing maze of offshore shell companies and hidden domestic accounts. The security firewalls were thick, designed specifically by expensive estate lawyers to keep the public and the government completely blind. But Silas was relentless. He systematically bypassed a county probate server and finally breached a secure, heavily encrypted archive containing the final, unedited draft of her father's last will and testament. Silas opened the massive digital file and began scrolling rapidly through pages of dense, suffocating legal jargon. The estate was absolutely massive, but Heather had been largely cut out of the primary inheritance due to her reckless spending habits and her father's deep documented hatred for Dion. However, as Silas scrolled down to the 3rd section of the document, his fingers suddenly stopped moving across the keyboard. He leaned closer to the glowing monitor, his eyes widening in genuine shock. He let out a low, disbelieving whistle and pointed a nicotine-stained finger at a specific heavily highlighted paragraph. I leaned in, squinting at the glowing text, forcing my tired eyes to translate the complex legal terminology. There it was, hidden in plain sight behind a wall of expensive legal protection. Heather's late father had established a massive, irrevocable private trust fund entirely in Aaliyah's name. The total guaranteed payout was exactly $4 million. My breath caught sharply in my throat. $4 million. That staggering amount of money was sitting completely untouched in a high-yield account generating thousands of dollars in interest every single month. But Heather's father was a fiercely controlling man even from the grave. He knew exactly how manipulative and greedy his own daughter was. He knew that if he simply handed her the money, she would drain the account in a matter of months and leave her disabled child with absolutely nothing. So the old man had engineered a brutal ironclad stipulation specifically designed to force Heather to be a responsible mother. Silas read the strict distribution clause aloud, his voice echoing in the quiet room. The $4 million trust fund would not pay out a single penny until Aaliyah successfully reached her 10th birthday. But the most critical, horrifying condition was the custody clause. In order to inherit the money on Aaliyah's behalf, Heather and Dion had to prove that the child had remained under their continuous legal guardianship or under a state-approved delegated care facility for the entire duration of that time. If they officially gave her up for traditional adoption, or if she was permanently removed from their legal umbrella by the state due to abuse, the entire $4 million would instantly be donated to a designated medical charity. They would lose absolutely everything. The sickening heavy truth crashed down on my shoulders with the weight of a collapsing building. I stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the metal desk to keep my tired legs from giving out. The entire nightmare suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. Dion and Heather never actually abandoned Aaliyah. They did not surrender her to the state because they were overwhelmed by her medical needs. They parked her. They found a massive, deliberate loophole in the trust fund requirements. By voluntarily surrendering her to a state-approved private medical facility like Oak Ridge, they legally maintained their status as the delegating guardians of her medical care. They successfully kept the strict requirements of the trust fund entirely intact without having to actually look at her, feed her, or care for her. Oak Ridge Private Care was not a random state placement. It was a corrupt, heavily paid accomplice. Dr. Vance, the arrogant facility director who had thrown me out onto the pavement, was absolutely in on the entire scam. Dion and Heather were quietly funneling cash to him under the table, essentially paying Oak Ridge a cheap monthly storage fee to keep my granddaughter locked entirely out of sight. They ordered Dr. Vance to keep Aaliyah heavily drugged on chemical sedatives so she would remain completely docile, unable to complain, unable to run away, and entirely invisible to the outside world. Aaliyah was 7 years old. Dion and Heather were using Oak Ridge as a dark, silent holding cell to essentially wait out the clock for 3 more excruciating years. They were completely willing to let my innocent granddaughter endure 3 years of chemical abuse, psychological torture, and absolute isolation just so they could cash a $4 million check on her 10th birthday. The profound evil of their plan completely transcended simple greed. It was a calculated, monstrous hostage situation legally sanctioned by a broken state system. If I tried to expose them through normal legal channels, Dr. Vance would simply hide the medical records, and Dion would use his expensive corporate lawyers to tie me up in family court for years while Aaliyah rotted in that sterile room. I could not fight them in a courtroom because they owned the courtroom. I looked at Silas, who was staring at me with a grim, silent understanding. The time for filing petitions and asking judges for permission was completely over. If I wanted to save my granddaughter's life, I was going to have to break every single law they were hiding behind, and I had to do it before Oak Ridge erased her mind forever. Silas did not just uncover the massive $4 million trust fund hidden in the probate records. He also spent the early hours of the morning systematically scraping the encrypted employee database of Oak Ridge Private Care. By the time the sun began to rise over the industrial skyline, Silas had found exactly what I needed to break into that fortress. He handed me a thick manila folder containing the dark secrets of a night shift security guard named Miller. Miller was completely buried in $50,000 of debt to a violent illegal sports betting syndicate operating out of the shipping yards. Silas had hacked into the syndicate ledgers and printed the absolute proof. I took those printed pages, loaded a heavy steel police flashlight into the deep pocket of my work coat, and drove my truck back out to that concrete compound under the cover of a freezing torrential midnight rain. I parked half a mile away in a dense thicket of trees and walked the rest of the way through the freezing mud. I waited in the dark shadows near the employee parking lot until Miller stepped out the back door for his scheduled cigarette break. Before he could even strike his lighter, I lunged out of the darkness, pinned his throat firmly against the cold, wet brick wall, and shoved the printed syndicate ledger directly into his face. I told him he had exactly two choices tonight. He could swipe his master security badge and let me inside the restricted medical wing right now, or I would email this ledger to the local police department and the syndicate enforcers simultaneously by pressing a single button on my phone. Miller looked into my eyes, saw that I had absolutely nothing left to lose, and wisely chose to live. He swallowed hard, swiped his badge against the metal door, disabled the exterior perimeter alarm, and led me down a dark, narrow utility corridor. He whispered frantically that I had exactly 10 minutes before the scheduled floor supervisor noticed he was missing from his designated post. I moved completely silently through the dim, sterile hallways of the restricted pediatric wing. The heavy, suffocating scent of industrial bleach and stale urine burned the back of my throat, turning my stomach. I navigated the maze of identical doors until I found her room at the very end of the corridor, marked only with a cold black barcode instead of a human name. The heavy metal door was incredibly thick, but the electronic lock glowed green. I pressed the handle down, slipped inside, and gently closed the door behind me, sealing myself in the dark. The room was nothing short of a prison cell. There were no colorful toys, no educational books, and no warm blankets. There was only a thin, heavily stained mattress resting on a bolted metal frame. Aaliyah was curled tightly into a small defensive ball under a scratchy gray blanket facing the blank cinder block wall. I dropped to my arthritic knees beside the metal bed frame, fighting the sharp, burning pain shooting through my joints. I gently placed my rough hand on her tiny shoulder. She flinched violently, pulling the blanket tightly over her head as if preparing to be struck. I carefully pulled the edge of the blanket back. I raised my swollen, taped hands in the dim yellow light filtering through the barred window above the bed. I frantically signed the exact textbook American Sign Language I had agonized over for weeks. I signed my name. I told her I loved her. I told her I knew about the hidden money and that I was here to rescue her from this nightmare. She stared at my moving hands with completely blank, terrifyingly empty eyes. The heavy chemical sedatives they had forced down her throat were clearly still fighting for absolute control of her brain, but I could also see a massive, impenetrable wall of emotional trauma hiding behind her dark eyes. Dion and Heather had thoroughly convinced her that I was the monster who had willingly thrown her away. Textbook grammar and perfect hand shapes were completely useless against that level of deep psychological damage. She refused to move a single muscle. The heavy analog clock on the cinderblock wall ticked loudly, echoing in the quiet room. 5 minutes left. My heart pounded against my ribs like a heavy steel hammer. If I could not get her to communicate and willingly come with me right now, carrying a screaming, struggling child through the corridors would guarantee we both ended up caught by the heavily armed guards. I had to reach the little girl trapped deep beneath the forced drugs and the parental lies. I slowly lowered my trembling hands and took a deep, shaky breath. I stopped trying to be a perfect linguistic translator and desperately searched my memories for the days before the world broke our family apart. When Aaliyah was 4 years old, long before Dion bought that massive house, and long before Heather decided a disabled child was bad for her social image, Aaliyah used to sit on my lap on the old wooden front porch. We had invented a silly, highly specific secret hand game. I would form my right hand into a clumsy, crawling spider, walking my rough fingers slowly up her tiny arm. She would use her small hands to form a beautiful butterfly that would swoop down and chase my scary spider away. It was not official, recognized sign language. It was our own private language. I reached out and gently tapped her knee to get her attention. I formed my scarred, deeply arthritic fingers into that familiar, clumsy spider. I walked it slowly across the rough texture of the gray blanket. I made the spider stumble over a fold in the fabric exactly the way I used to do it on the porch. Aaliyah froze completely. Her shallow chest stopped heaving. She slowly lowered the blanket away from her face and stared intensely at my hand. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. For 10 agonizing seconds, absolutely nothing happened. Then slowly, miraculously, her tiny bruised fingers began to uncurl. She brought her small hands together, crossing her thumbs over each other, and gently fluttered her fingers to form the delicate wings of a butterfly. She swooped her hands down and gently tapped my spider. The massive emotional dam inside her chest completely shattered in an instant. Hot, heavy tears instantly flooded her dark eyes, spilling rapidly down her pale cheeks. She threw her thin arms tightly around my neck and buried her face into my heavy, damp work coat, shaking violently with intense, silent sobs. I held her incredibly tight, burying my face in her shoulder, letting my own tears fall freely into her hair. After a long, desperate moment of pure relief, she pulled back. She looked me directly in the eyes, her expression shifting instantly from profound sorrow to an urgent, desperate need to finally be heard. She raised her tiny hands in the dim light. She did not use our silly childhood game anymore. She used perfect, sharp, undeniably clear American Sign Language. She signed the words with a fierce, heartbreaking clarity that proved her brilliant mind was completely intact beneath the drugs. She told me she was so sorry for ignoring me in the visiting room earlier. Her hands moved faster now, shaking heavily with the raw weight of her trauma. She signed that her mother had lied to her. She signed that before they forced her into the state van, her mother had dragged her down the stairs and locked her in the cold, dark basement of their house for 3 entire days. She signed the exact unforgivable words Heather had screamed at her through the wooden door. Mom locked me in the dark. Mom said I was garbage. Mom said you did not want me anymore because my brain was broken. The sheer, unfiltered cruelty of those words, signed flawlessly by a 7-year-old child, struck me with the devastating force of a speeding freight train. Dion and Heather had intentionally tortured her. They had locked a helpless, mute child in a dark basement specifically to break her spirit, ensuring she would be entirely compliant before handing her over to the corrupt state facility. I grabbed her tiny hands gently and signed back fiercely that we were leaving this horrible prison right now and they would never hurt her again. I reached down, wrapping my thick arms around her waist to lift her off the metal bed. At that exact terrifying second, the entire concrete building violently erupted. A deafening, high-pitched security siren began shrieking mercilessly through the ceiling speakers above our heads. Blinding, aggressive red strobe lights began flashing rapidly in the hallway outside the door, casting harsh shadows across the room. Dr. Vance had a hidden motion-activated security camera completely concealed inside the plastic casing of the smoke detector mounted directly above the bed. Through the thick door, I heard the frantic, staticky crackle of a security radio. It was Miller's abandoned radio lying somewhere in the hallway. Dr. Vance was screaming absolute bloody murder over the open security frequency. He shouted that there was an unauthorized intruder actively breaching room 4 in the pediatric wing. But he did not order his guards to come and arrest me. He ordered his heavily armed transport team to breach the room, grab the girl immediately, and force her into the armored medical transport van idling out back. He yelled at the top of his lungs that she was a high-liability financial target. He commanded them to initiate an emergency off-the-books transfer to a completely unregulated black site sister facility in Nevada. He explicitly ordered them to make sure she vanished so deeply into the underground system that no lawyer, no cop, and no grandfather would ever be able to find her again. The terrifying sound of heavy combat boots began pounding aggressively down the concrete corridor, sprinting directly toward our door. The heavy combat boots reached the door before I could even take a single step toward safety. 3 massive security guards burst into the tiny flashing room, tackling me violently to the hard concrete floor. I fought like an absolute madman, throwing heavy punches with my ruined, swollen hands, but there were simply too many of them. One guard drove a heavy armored knee directly into my spine, pinning me down, while the other aggressively ripped Aaliyah right out of my arms. She screamed silently, her tiny hands reaching out for me in pure desperation as they dragged her away down the blinking red corridor. The third guard kicked me incredibly hard in the ribs, leaving me gasping for oxygen on the floor as they sprinted toward the back exit. I refused to let it end like this. I forced myself up, completely ignoring the agonizing, blinding pain in my chest, and stumbled blindly out of the room. By the time I burst through the heavy metal fire exit doors into the freezing, torrential midnight rain, it was already too late. I watched helplessly as the armed guards threw my terrified granddaughter into the back of a heavily armored black medical transport van. The thick steel doors slammed shut, locking her inside a dark cage. The van engine roared to life, its heavy tires violently kicking up thick mud as it tore out of the facility parking lot and sped aggressively toward the dark, winding county highway. I did not waste a single second screaming at the sky. I sprinted through the freezing rain and the thick mud toward the dark tree line where I had parked my heavy steelworker truck, my mind entirely set on absolute destruction. I threw myself into the driver's seat of my old pickup truck, my clothes completely soaked and heavy with freezing rain. I jammed the key into the ignition and slammed my heavy work boot down on the gas pedal. The heavy V8 engine roared with a deafening mechanical fury, completely drowning out the sound of the thunder echoing overhead. I tore out of the tree line, smashing directly through a wooden perimeter fence and hit the wet asphalt of the county highway. The bright red taillights of the black medical transport van were already a half-mile ahead, disappearing rapidly into the heavy, blinding downpour. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my damaged knuckles threatened to burst entirely through the skin. I pushed the heavy truck past 80 miles an hour on the slick, treacherous road, the speedometer needle bouncing wildly. The windshield wipers violently thrashed back and forth, barely clearing the massive sheets of water crashing against the glass. I was completely consumed by a cold, calculated rage. I was no longer a retired grandfather trying to navigate a broken legal system. I was a desperate, dangerous man hunting the monsters who had actively tortured my blood. I slowly closed the distance, the heavy steel grille of my truck inching closer to the rear bumper of the speeding van. The driver of the van spotted my headlights approaching rapidly in his rearview mirror. He immediately swerved into the oncoming lane, pushing the heavy armored vehicle to its absolute limit to shake me off his tail. We tore through the dark, winding rural roads at terrifying speeds, hydroplaning across massive puddles that threatened to send both of our vehicles spinning uncontrollably into the dense, dark woods. He aggressively brake-checked me suddenly, slamming on his brakes, hoping my heavy truck would slide out of control. But 40 years of driving heavy machinery had taught me exactly how to handle violent momentum. I downshifted instantly, maintained my tire traction, and slammed the heavy front bumper of my truck violently into the back left quarter panel of the van. The massive metal impact sounded like a bomb exploding over the roaring rain. The van fishtailed wildly across the center line, but the driver managed to regain control at the absolute last second. I knew I could not simply follow him until he ran out of gas. If he successfully reached the state line and crossed into Nevada, Aaliyah would vanish into an unregulated black site forever, and I would never see her again. I had to end the pursuit right now. I pressed the accelerator all the way to the floorboard, forcing my roaring truck directly alongside the armored van. The driver looked over at me through the rain-streaked window, his eyes wide with sudden, genuine panic. He tried to merge aggressively into my lane to force my truck off the steep embankment, but my truck was built out of solid, heavy Detroit steel. I braced my thick arms heavily against the steering wheel and violently cranked the wheel to the right. My heavy truck slammed directly into the side of the van with a devastating metal-crushing crunch. I kept the heavy pressure locked, physically pushing the heavy van entirely off the wet asphalt. The van tires caught the soft, muddy shoulder of the highway. The armored vehicle instantly lost all traction, violently skidded sideways across the wet grass, and crashed heavily into a deep drainage ditch, coming to a sudden, violent halt against a thick embankment of solid dirt. I slammed my brakes and shoved the truck into park before it even came to a complete stop on the shoulder of the road. I grabbed the heavy, solid steel tire iron from the passenger floorboard, the freezing metal grounding my frantic thoughts, and jumped out into the pouring rain. I marched purposefully toward the disabled van, my heavy work boots sinking deep into the mud. The front end of the armored van was completely crumpled against the dirt wall, thick white smoke pouring rapidly from the crushed radiator and hissing loudly in the rain. The driver was frantically trying to unbuckle his jammed seatbelt, coughing violently through the toxic smoke filling the cabin. I did not give him a chance to reach for a radio or a weapon. I swung the heavy steel tire iron with every single ounce of strength left in my arthritic shoulders. I smashed the thick driver's side window, sending a massive shower of sharp safety glass exploding directly into the cabin. I reached through the shattered window, grabbed the driver roughly by the thick collar of his tactical vest, and violently hauled him right out of the broken vehicle. I threw him face first into the deep, freezing mud. I stood towering over him in the rain, raising the heavy tire iron high in the air, roaring at him to stay perfectly still on the ground if he wanted to live to see tomorrow. He scrambled backward in the mud, holding his shaking hands up in complete surrender. I abandoned him instantly and ran to the heavy rear doors of the van. The electronic locks were completely dead from the massive crash impact. I wedged the sharp end of the tire iron directly into the thick metal door seam and violently pried the heavy steel apart. My arthritic hands screamed in absolute agony, muscles tearing and joints popping under the extreme pressure until the heavy locking latch finally snapped with a loud, satisfying crack. I threw the heavy doors open. Aaliyah was huddled tightly in the corner of the dark metal cage, trembling violently, her eyes wide with absolute terror. I dropped the bloody tire iron into the mud, fell to my aching knees in the back of the van, and pulled her tightly into my chest. She wrapped her small, bruised arms around my neck, burying her face into my wet coat. I carefully carried her out of the crushed van and buckled her safely into the passenger seat of my warm truck, wrapping her securely in my heavy, dry flannel shirt. I climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the heavy door shut, locking us safely inside the warm cabin. I looked over at Aaliyah, who was shivering violently from the freezing cold and the harsh residual effects of the chemical sedatives leaving her system. I placed my rough hand gently on her head and promised her that the nightmare at Oak Ridge was permanently over. But as I shifted the heavy truck back into gear to pull onto the highway, a piercing, high-pitched tone erupted suddenly from my prepaid burner phone sitting in the center console. The digital screen lit up the dark cabin with a harsh, glaring red notification. It was a statewide emergency Amber Alert. I picked it up and read the text. It displayed my full legal name, the exact license plate of my steelworker truck, and officially labeled me as an armed, extremely dangerous kidnapper who had violently abducted a severely disabled child from a medical facility. A second later, the faint, undeniable sound of multiple police sirens began echoing through the dark, rainy woods behind us, growing rapidly louder with every passing heartbeat. Dr. Vance and my wealthy son had successfully manipulated the entire federal law enforcement system against me before I even got her out of the van. I was no longer just a desperate grandfather trying to save his family. I was now an official fugitive from the FBI, entirely cut off from my home, my bank accounts, and the protection of the law. I grabbed the burner phone from the center console, rolled down my window, and hurled the plastic device far out into the freezing dark woods. The glowing red screen vanished into the heavy brush, severing their only digital leash on my exact location. I killed my headlights immediately and yanked the heavy steering wheel hard to the right, plunging my truck down a deeply rutted, unpaved logging road just seconds before 3 state trooper cruisers roared past us on the main highway. Their blazing blue lights cut violently through the torrential rain, illuminating the trees like flashes of lightning. We were completely off the grid now. But the harsh, crushing reality of our situation settled heavily onto my tired shoulders. I could never go back to my house. Every single bank account, every credit card, and every digital footprint tied to my legal name was currently being actively frozen and monitored by federal agents. We had absolutely no money, no safe shelter, and no legal identity. But the most terrifying immediate threat was sitting right next to me in the passenger seat. Aaliyah was not just shivering from the cold rain anymore. Her tiny body was suddenly consumed by a violent, aggressive tremor. Her skin was burning with an unnaturally high fever, radiating a terrifying heat through the damp flannel shirt I had wrapped tightly around her. Dr. Vance had pumped her full of heavy, highly addictive chemical sedatives for weeks to keep her compliant. Her fragile nervous system was now crashing rapidly, throwing her into severe, life-threatening physical withdrawal. I needed to get her to an emergency room immediately. But the moment any hospital staff saw her face or typed her name into the federal triage database, an armed tactical unit would swarm the building. They would arrest me on the spot and drag her right back to the dark basement of Oak Ridge. I navigated the dark, treacherous back roads, blindly relying entirely on the internal compass I had built during 40 years of driving to the steel mill before dawn. I steered the heavy truck deep into the decaying industrial underbelly of the city, far away from the wealthy suburbs and the manicured lawns where Dion and Heather lived. This was the Forgotten District. Massive, rusting silos and abandoned brick factories loomed in the darkness like giant mechanical skeletons against the stormy sky. I pulled into the crumbling asphalt parking lot of an abandoned, boarded-up Catholic church sitting right in the heavy shadow of my old blast furnace plant. This was the undisputed territory of my old Union brothers. We were the men who had poured the boiling steel that built the skyscrapers of this city, and we protected our own when the rest of society looked the other way. I killed the engine, gently, lifted my burning, violently shaking granddaughter into my arms, and kicked the heavy wooden side door of the church open. I descended the dark, narrow stone steps into the cavernous basement. A thick cloud of cigar smoke and the low hum of a portable diesel generator greeted me. 5 massive, heavily scarred older men sitting around a battered poker table instantly stood up their hands, instinctively reaching for the heavy iron wrenches and shotguns resting near their chairs. It was Big Mo, my former shift foreman, standing at the front of the pack. Big Mo took one look at my severely bruised face, my bleeding knuckles, and the dying child in my arms. He did not ask a single question. He pointed a thick, calloused finger toward a worn velvet sofa in the corner of the damp basement, and barked aggressive orders at the other men to barricade the heavy metal doors upstairs. I laid Aaliyah gently onto the sofa. Her breathing was terrifyingly shallow and incredibly rapid. Her eyes rolled back slightly, and she let out a weak, silent gasp of pure agony. Big Mo pulled a small, portable television from a metal shelf. The local news channel was already broadcasting my face, and the statewide Amber Alert, to millions of viewers. Big Mo looked at the glowing television screen, then looked down at my granddaughter. He told me the entire state police force was turning the city upside down, looking for my specific truck. I looked him directly in the eye and begged him to help me save her life without calling a government ambulance. Big Mo nodded grimly, pulled a heavy flip phone from his denim overall pocket, and dialed a number entirely off the books. He told the person on the other end to grab the heavy trauma bag and get to the church basement immediately. 20 agonizing minutes later, a heavy knock echoed against the reinforced basement door. A tall, remarkably thin man wearing a faded military jacket hurried down the stone steps carrying a massive olive-green medical canvas bag. We called him Doc. He was a brilliant former combat medic who had lost his official state medical license years ago after speaking out against a corrupt hospital administration. Despite his disgraced legal status, he remained the primary underground physician for every undocumented worker and disgraced union man in the industrial sector. Doc took one look at Aaliyah and immediately dropped to his knees beside the sofa. His hands moved with an incredible practiced speed. He checked her severely elevated pulse, pulled a small tactical flashlight to examine her dilated pupils, and instantly diagnosed the exact chemical withdrawal taking place. He quickly pulled a bag of intravenous saline and a series of small glass vials from his canvas bag. He explained quietly that her brain was essentially misfiring due to the sudden, violent absence of the heavy narcotics Oak Ridge had been continuously forcing into her bloodstream. He expertly found a fragile vein in her tiny, bruised arm and started the IV drip. He carefully injected a highly calculated microscopic dose of a medical counteragent designed specifically to stabilize her crashing nervous system without putting her back into a chemical coma. For 3 grueling, terrifying hours, we sat completely silent in that damp concrete basement, watching the clear fluid drip slowly into her arm. Doc wiped her burning forehead with cold, wet rags, continuously monitoring her fragile heartbeat with his worn stethoscope. Slowly, miraculously, the violent tremors began to subside. The terrifying burning heat radiating from her skin gradually faded away, replaced by a cool, natural sweat. Her breathing deepened, returning to a steady, peaceful rhythm. The fever finally broke entirely. Aaliyah fell into her first state of natural, unmedicated sleep in weeks, her tiny hand clutching my thick thumb tightly. Doc packed up his medical canvas bag, patted my shoulder silently, and slipped back out into the rainy night. Big Mo handed me a steaming cup of black coffee, but I could not drink it. I sat heavily on a wooden crate next to the sofa, watching my granddaughter sleep peacefully in the dim generator light. We had successfully survived the night, but the crushing reality of the morning was closing in rapidly. I was completely trapped in a concrete basement. If I tried to run across state lines with her, the Federal Highway Patrol would inevitably catch me. If I stayed hidden down here indefinitely, Aaliyah would never have a real life, never go to a proper school, and never walk in the sunlight again. Simply hiding was a guaranteed death sentence for both of us. I realized with absolute clarity that playing defense was completely useless against people like Dion and Heather. They controlled the narrative, they controlled the police, and they controlled the legal system. I needed a weapon far more powerful than my old steelworker truck or my bruised fists. I needed a legal nuclear bomb to completely obliterate their pristine public image and tear their $4 million financial fortress down to the very foundation. I asked Big Mo to borrow his untraceable flip phone. I dialed a private, highly exclusive number I had memorized over 20 years ago. It was the direct personal line to Mr. Gallagher. He was currently the most ruthless, feared, and devastating corporate attorney in the entire state. He destroyed massive corporations for a living. But 30 years ago, he was just an arrogant young intern touring our steel mill when a massive overhead iron crane snapped. I had tackled him violently to the concrete floor, shattering my own shoulder to save him from being crushed to death by 3 tons of falling iron. He owed me an absolute life debt, and I was calling to collect it right now. The heavy metal door of the church basement groaned loudly as Mr. Gallagher stepped out of the freezing rain and descended into the dim, smoke-filled room. Despite the late hour and the gritty industrial surroundings, my former intern was dressed in an immaculate charcoal gray tailored suit. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and an aura of absolute terrifying authority. Big Mo and the other steelworkers instinctively stepped back, giving the high-powered corporate attorney a wide berth. Gallagher did not waste time on pleasantries. He walked directly over to the worn velvet sofa, looked down at Aaliyah sleeping peacefully under the thick blankets, and let out a long, heavy sigh. I quickly briefed him on everything Silas had uncovered regarding the $4 million trust fund, the horrific chemical abuse at Oak Ridge, and the brutal reality that Dion and Heather had locked this little girl in a dark basement to break her spirit. I expected Gallagher to immediately start drafting legal petitions. Instead, he snapped his briefcase shut and looked me directly in the eye with a cold, unforgiving pragmatism. He told me the brutal truth. I had just committed multiple federal felonies. I had assaulted state medical personnel, destroyed a government transport vehicle, and technically kidnapped a legal ward of the state. He explained that Dion and Heather possessed a bottomless legal defense fund. They would easily convince any family court judge that Aaliyah's traumatic memories were simply the fabricated drug-induced hallucinations of a severely disabled child. Without concrete, irrefutable physical evidence proving that Heather had actively tortured the child before the state surrender, Gallagher warned me I would spend the rest of my natural life rotting in a federal penitentiary, and Aaliyah would be handed right back to the monsters who broke her. I needed a ghost from the past to testify in the present. Gallagher gave me exactly 24 hours to produce the impossible before the FBI officially raided the church. I walked over to the sofa, gently kissed my sleeping granddaughter's warm forehead, and promised Big Mo I would be back before dawn. I borrowed Big Mo's rusted, unremarkable sedan, leaving my heavily flagged steelworker truck hidden in the alleyway. I drove back across the city lines, leaving the decaying industrial sector behind, and headed straight into the pristine, wealthy suburbs where Dion and Heather used to live. The sprawling colonial house was entirely dark when I pulled onto the quiet street. The massive moving trucks had long since departed, and the property was now fully surrounded by heavy metal scaffolding and thick white construction tarps. The new homeowners had clearly begun a massive, expensive interior renovation. I parked 2 blocks away, pulled my heavy coat collar up against the freezing rain, and slipped silently through the dark, manicured backyards. I reached the rear patio and found a large glass window temporarily covered by a thick sheet of plastic. I pulled a sharp pocket knife from my coat, sliced a long vertical slit down the center of the plastic, and carefully climbed inside the hollow, echoing house. The interior was completely unrecognizable. The expensive hardwood floors had been ripped up, and the walls were stripped down to the bare wooden studs. I navigated the dark, massive space entirely by memory, my heavy work boots stepping carefully over scattered construction tools and coiled electrical wires. I walked past the grand living room where Heather used to host her lavish parties and headed straight down the main hallway toward the basement door. The heavy wooden door had been secured with a thick, brand-new, heavy-duty padlock by the construction crew. I reached into my coat and pulled out a solid steel crowbar I had borrowed from Big Mo's toolbox. I wedged the flat edge of the crowbar deep behind the metal padlock bracket. I braced my heavy boots against the wall, ignored the agonizing sharp pain flaring rapidly through my arthritic shoulders, and violently threw my entire body weight backward. The heavy metal bracket ripped cleanly out of the wooden door frame with a loud, echoing crack. The door swung open, revealing the steep, pitch-black wooden staircase leading down into the freezing depths of the house. I clicked on a small tactical pen light, and slowly descended into the cold, damp darkness, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. The basement was a massive, unfinished concrete cavern smelling strongly of wet earth and old dust. I swept the narrow beam of my penlight across the empty space until I found exactly what I was looking for. Tucked away in the furthest, darkest corner of the basement was a small, heavy wooden storage closet. This was the dark cell where Heather had locked a terrified, mute 7-year-old girl for 3 agonizing days. I walked slowly toward the closet, my breathing incredibly shallow. I pulled the heavy door open and directed the bright beam of my flashlight onto the interior wooden panels. My stomach violently dropped and a sickening wave of pure nausea washed over me. The entire bottom half of the thick wooden door was completely covered in deep, frantic, overlapping scratch marks. I dropped to my knees and examined the deep grooves in the wood. Embedded deep inside the splintered wood were dark, undeniable stains of old, dried blood. It was the physical aftermath of Aaliyah desperately trying to claw her way out of the dark until her tiny fingernails bled. The raw physical evidence of her torture was permanently etched right into the architecture of the house. But bloody scratch marks alone could easily be blamed on a stray animal by a skilled corporate lawyer. I needed the undeniable face of the monster. I stood up and pointed my flashlight directly up at the dark, exposed wooden rafters running across the basement ceiling. 5 years ago, when Dayon first bought this massive house, he had asked me to install a basic security system to save money on installation fees. I had wired the entire house myself. Dion only cared about the exterior cameras covering his expensive cars. He completely forgot about the central electrical breaker box located down here in the basement. Knowing how critical the power supply was to the entire security network, I had secretly installed one additional hardwired micro camera directly above the breaker panel, entirely concealed inside an empty dummy smoke detector casing. I dragged a heavy wooden construction sawhorse over to the center of the room and climbed up my damaged knees, screaming in protest. The dusty plastic smoke detector was still perfectly secured to the wooden rafter. The renovation crew had not reached the ceiling yet. I pulled my pocket knife, wedged the blade into the plastic seam, and popped the casing open. Inside, covered in 5 years of thick dust, was a tiny, self-contained digital hard drive. I carefully extracted the small metal square and slipped it deeply into the inside breast pocket of my coat. I had her. I finally had the absolute, irrefutable proof of Heather's unforgivable cruelty. A sudden, blinding flash of bright white light violently pierced the darkness of the basement. A heavy vehicle had just pulled aggressively into the front driveway, its high-beam headlights sweeping directly through the exposed ground floor windows above me. I instantly killed my penlight, plunging myself back into the pitch-black darkness. Heavy car doors slammed shut, echoing loudly through the empty house. The new homeowners had returned unexpectedly in the middle of the night to check on the renovation progress. I scrambled quickly down from the wooden sawhorse, desperately trying to reach the back staircase. But before I could even take 3 steps in the dark, the deafening, terrifying wail of multiple police sirens erupted simultaneously right outside the front door. The loud crack of my crowbar on the basement padlock had silently tripped the active construction site security alarm over 10 minutes ago. Powerful, heavy flashlights began cutting violently through the darkness at the top of the basement stairs. 2 armed police officers charged down the wooden steps, their service weapons drawn, and pointed directly at my chest. They screamed at me to drop to the concrete floor and put my hands behind my head. I did not fight them. I slowly dropped to my knees on the cold floor and allowed them to violently lock heavy steel handcuffs tightly around my swollen wrists. They aggressively hauled me up and read me my absolute rights, completely unaware that the tiny, dusty hard drive safely hidden inside my coat pocket was about to unleash a legal apocalypse they could never comprehend. The freezing metal bench of the precinct holding cell offered absolutely no comfort for my battered spine. I sat in the dim, sterile light, my hands securely cuffed to the thick iron ring bolted to the concrete wall. The physical pain radiating from my swollen knuckles and severely bruised ribs was a constant burning fire, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the agonizing dread crushing my chest. I had the tiny plastic hard drive safely hidden inside my left shoe, slipped down past my ankle just seconds before the arresting officers patted me down on the basement stairs. But keeping the evidence safe felt like a hollow, entirely meaningless victory. Shortly after sunrise, Mr. Gallagher walked into the holding area wearing his immaculate gray suit, but his face was completely drained of its usual arrogant confidence. He sat on the metal stool across from me and delivered the devastating blow. The state police had managed to trace the GPS signal from the disabled medical transport van directly back to the industrial sector. A heavily armed federal tactical unit had violently raided the abandoned church an hour ago. Big Mo and the other steelworkers were arrested on multiple felony harboring charges, and Aaliyah was ripped away from the only safe place she had known. Gallagher told me she was currently being held in a secure, undisclosed state medical ward under heavy armed guard. It felt like the entire world had just collapsed entirely onto my shoulders. I had sacrificed everything, risked the lives of my oldest friends, and pushed my body past its absolute physical limits only to end up exactly where my wealthy son wanted me. Gallagher pulled a sleek silver tablet from his leather briefcase and slid it across the cold metal table. He told me to watch the screen carefully so I understood exactly what kind of war we were fighting. The screen illuminated with a live broadcast from a major national news network. The footage showed the wide marble steps of the downtown federal courthouse completely swarmed by flashing cameras and dozens of eager reporters. Standing right at the center of a massive podium surrounded by a wall of elite high-priced corporate attorneys were Dion and Heather. They were putting on an absolute masterclass in public manipulation. Heather was wearing a modest conservative black dress, her hair pulled back, simply clutching a small embroidered handkerchief. She wept openly for the cameras, producing large, heavy tears that conveniently never ruined her flawless makeup. She leaned heavily against Dion, playing the role of the utterly devastated, terrified mother to absolute perfection. Dion wore a dark blue suit, looking solemn and fiercely protective. He stepped up to the array of microphones and began spinning a completely fabricated, sickening narrative. He told the national audience that his elderly father had been suffering from severe, untreated mental deterioration for years. He painted me as a violent, deeply paranoid man who harbored an unhealthy, obsessive attachment to my granddaughter. He completely omitted the $15,000 he stole. He omitted the luxury SUV. He omitted the absolute fact that they had voluntarily surrendered her to a corrupt state facility. Instead, Dion stared directly into the television cameras and stated that I had violently attacked a pediatric hospital, assaulted innocent medical nurses, and ripped his severely disabled, medically fragile daughter from her specialized care unit. He pleaded with the public to respect their privacy while they recovered from this horrifying family trauma. The sheer, unfiltered hypocrisy of his words made the blood pound violently in my ears. They were actively torturing a 7-year-old child in the shadows while successfully convincing the entire country that they were the absolute victims. I looked up from the glowing tablet, my jaw clenched so tightly my teeth threatened to crack. I told Gallagher about the tiny digital hard drive hidden inside my shoe. I told him it contained the absolute undeniable video proof of Heather violently locking Aaliyah in that dark basement. A sudden, dangerous spark ignited in Gallagher's cold eyes. He demanded I hand over the drive immediately. He explained that standard criminal defense procedures would take months to process the evidence, but we did not have months. If Aaliyah remained in state custody for even one more week, Dion and Heather would simply hire private transport to move her to the Nevada Black Site facility permanently. We had to strike right at the absolute heart of the beast. Gallagher stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and completely bypassed the normal criminal arraignment process. Using his massive network of political favors and dark leverage within the judicial system, he forced an emergency, highly irregular family court hearing to address the active restraining order and the immediate physical custody of the child. It was a massive, incredibly risky legal gamble. Gallagher successfully pulled major strings to bypass the standard chain of custody protocols, bullying a terrified court clerk into officially admitting the dusty hard drive into the evidentiary record just minutes before the hearing began. Heavily armed guards transferred me from the freezing precinct directly to the bustling downtown courthouse. I was marched into the grand oak-paneled courtroom, still wearing my wrinkled, damp work clothes and heavy steel handcuffs. Dion and Heather were already sitting at the plaintiff's table, flanked by 3 incredibly expensive corporate lawyers. When they saw me walk into the room, Heather's fake weeping demeanor instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, arrogant glare of absolute superiority. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down and the emergency hearing commenced. Gallagher immediately stood up and formally submitted the hard drive to the presiding judge, boldly claiming it contained undeniable video evidence of severe premeditated child abuse committed directly by the biological mother. But Heather's lead attorney, a slick, silver-haired man with a venomous smile, was already fully prepared for an ambush. He stood up and launched a devastating, highly coordinated legal counterattack. He loudly argued that the hard drive was completely inadmissible. He claimed that because I had illegally broken into an active construction site in the middle of the night, any evidence I found was legally poisoned. He went even further, suggesting to the judge that a mentally unstable former steelworker could have easily fabricated or digitally altered the old footage to frame his wealthy son. Gallagher fiercely countered that the child herself could verbally confirm the events on the video, but the silver-haired lawyer simply smiled wider. He immediately filed a heavily documented medical motion backed by Dr. Vance from Oak Ridge, legally declaring Aaliyah completely mentally incompetent to testify. He argued that her profound muteness, combined with her severe intellectual disabilities and the recent trauma of my violent kidnapping, rendered her entirely incapable of distinguishing truth from fiction in a court of law. The judge, an older, exhausted-looking man, looked down at my massive criminal rap sheet from the previous 24 hours. He looked at the impeccably dressed parents. He let out a heavy sigh and adjusted his glasses, stating clearly that bringing a severely traumatized, nonverbal child into a brutal courtroom battle was highly inappropriate. He declared he was heavily leaning toward dismissing the video evidence entirely and officially returning full physical custody of the child to her parents by the end of the hour. We had brought the absolute truth into the light, and the expensive lawyers were suffocating it right in front of my eyes. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom remained firmly closed to the press, but the suffocating tension inside the room was thick enough to choke on. I sat rigidly at the defense table, the rough, bright orange fabric of my county jail jumpsuit scratching painfully against my bruised ribs. The heavy steel chains binding my wrists clinked loudly against the polished mahogany table every time I shifted my weight. Across the center aisle, Dion and Heather looked as though they had just stepped off the cover of a wealthy lifestyle magazine. Dion wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, idly adjusting a heavy gold watch on his wrist. Heather sat entirely composed in her elegant black designer dress, her posture perfectly straight, projecting the absolute picture of a grieving, deeply concerned mother. The visual contrast was a deliberate, sickening tactic designed by their expensive legal team. They wanted the judge to see a pristine, successful, loving family being terrorized by a deranged, violent grandfather dressed in the neon colors of a convicted criminal. The judge looked down at me from his elevated bench with profound disgust, completely ready to dismiss my claims and hand my granddaughter right back to the monsters sitting 10 feet away. But Mr. Gallagher did not become the most feared corporate attorney in the state by surrendering when a piece of evidence was blocked. He possessed a terrifying predatory calmness. If the judge refused to look at the violent video evidence from the basement due to a technicality, Gallagher was simply going to publicly butcher their pristine character until the judge had no choice but to listen. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and completely abandoned the argument over the hard drive. Instead, he formally called Dion to the witness stand. Dion stood up confidently, offering a warm, respectful smile to the judge as he swore on the Bible. He sat in the wooden witness box looking entirely unbothered, completely arrogant in the belief that his wealth made him absolutely bulletproof. Gallagher approached the stand holding a thick stack of financial documents Silas had pulled from the dark web. He did not ask Dion about his parenting style. He asked him about the $15,000 I had handed him in cash specifically for Aaliyah's speech therapy. Dion smiled condescendingly, stating smoothly that he had deposited the funds into a general family account to manage her overall care. Gallagher did not raise his voice. He simply handed a stamped, certified bank receipt to the bailiff who passed it to the judge. Gallagher stated for the court record that exactly 2 hours after I handed Dion the cash, $15,000 was wired directly from that account to a luxury auto dealership to purchase a premium SUV registered exclusively in Heather's name. Dion's confident smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, arguing that a safe, reliable vehicle was absolutely necessary to transport a disabled child to her medical appointments. Gallagher practically lunged. He stepped incredibly close to the witness box, his voice suddenly echoing with a terrifying, booming authority. He asked Dion how often Aaliyah rode in that new SUV, considering she was surrendered to the state less than 10 days after the vehicle was purchased. Before Dion's expensive lawyers could even voice an objection, Gallagher pulled a second, far more devastating set of documents from his briefcase. He presented the hidden encrypted wire transfers Silas had unearthed between Dion's personal accounts and Dr. Vance's offshore shell company. Gallagher systematically laid out the exact financial trail. He proved that Dion and Heather were not paying Oak Ridge Private Care for specialized medical treatment. They were secretly funneling thousands of dollars directly into the facility director's private bank account disguised as consulting fees. It was an undeniable, documented paper trail of heavy bribes specifically designed to keep Aaliyah heavily sedated, hidden away, and legally classified as a state ward so they could protect their $4 million trust fund without actually raising her. The pristine facade completely shattered. Dion began sweating profusely under the harsh courtroom lights. His expensive suit suddenly looked far too tight. He stammered frantically, looking toward his legal team for a lifeline, unable to form a coherent sentence as Gallagher aggressively hammered him with date after date, transaction after transaction, publicly exposing him as a greedy, corrupt fraud who sold his own daughter to a chemical prison. But while Dion was visibly crumbling on the stand, Heather remained an absolute pillar of ice. I watched her closely from the defense table. She did not sweat. She did not flinch. Her dark eyes were completely dead, entirely devoid of any human empathy. She smoothly passed a handwritten note to her lead attorney. The silver-haired lawyer immediately stood up and shouted a forceful objection, deliberately cutting off Gallagher's relentless assault. The lawyer looked directly at the judge and smoothly reframed the entire narrative. He argued passionately that Dion was simply an overwhelmed father trying to secure premium private care for his disabled daughter in a notoriously underfunded state system. He claimed the consulting fees were entirely legal retainers for Dr. Vance's exclusive medical expertise. Heather sat perfectly still, radiating a terrifying sociopathic calm. She knew exactly what game they were playing. She knew that looking bad on a financial ledger was absolutely not the legal equivalent of physical child abuse. Her lawyer aggressively demanded that the court stop allowing this hostile financial witch hunt and immediately return the terrified child to her loving, wealthy parents. The heavy courtroom fell completely silent as the judge reviewed the financial documents. He took off his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. He looked down at Gallagher and delivered a devastating, strictly legal ruling. The judge firmly stated that while the financial transfers were highly irregular and potentially warranted a separate civil investigation for tax fraud, this was an emergency family court custody hearing. The burden of proof required to permanently sever parental rights and grant custody to a violent, arrested grandfather was incredibly high. The judge explicitly stated that financial mismanagement, greed, and even bribery did not legally prove that Heather had actively physically tortured or endangered the child. Because the basement video was legally poisoned by my illegal break in the court, was completely blind to the physical abuse. The judge raised his heavy wooden gavel, stating that without a direct, legally competent witness who could explicitly testify to the physical danger, he was legally bound to dismiss my petition and return Aaliyah to state custody for immediate transfer back to her parents. My heart completely stopped in my chest. The crushing weight of absolute defeat pressed down on my lungs. Heather allowed a tiny victorious smirk to creep onto her face. But Mr. Gallagher did not sit down. He stood tall in the center of the courtroom, an incredibly dangerous smile forming on his lips. He looked directly at the judge and stated loudly that the defense did in fact have a direct first-hand witness to the physical torture who was currently waiting in the judge's private chambers. The silver-haired lawyer laughed out loud, reminding the court that Dr. Vance had legally certified Aaliyah as profoundly mentally incompetent to testify. Gallagher turned his head, locking eyes with Heather. He stated that the defense was not calling a mentally incompetent ward of the state. The defense was formally calling a highly intelligent, fully communicative 7-year-old girl who was completely ready to speak for herself. Gallagher demanded that the bailiff bring Aaliyah into the courtroom and call her to the witness stand. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom slowly opened. 2 armed bailiffs escorted Aaliyah down the center aisle. She looked incredibly small and fragile, wrapped in an oversized, state-issued sweater, her dark eyes darting frantically around the massive, intimidating room. The residual effects of the chemical withdrawal still lingered in the slight tremor of her hands, but the terrifying, glassy stare was entirely gone. She was painfully, acutely aware of her surroundings. As the bailiff guided her up the steps into the heavy wooden witness box, she caught sight of her parents. Dion shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Heather leaned forward. Heather did not say a single word. She did not have to. She locked her cold, dead eyes directly onto Aaliyah's face and delivered a silent, venomous glare of absolute intimidation. It was the exact same terrifying look she had undoubtedly given the child right before dragging her down the stairs and locking her in that freezing basement. Aaliyah froze completely. Her tiny chest began to heave with sudden, rapid panic. She shrank back against the hard wooden chair, pulling her knees up to her chest, desperately trying to make herself invisible. The silver-haired defense attorney stood up with a smug smile, loudly pointing out to the judge that the child was clearly in a state of severe mental distress and entirely incapable of participating in these complex legal proceedings. The judge raised his hand, preparing to dismiss her from the stand immediately. I could not sit there and let that monster terrorize my granddaughter in an open courtroom. I completely ignored the heavy steel chains binding my wrists and stood straight up from the defense table. The heavy metal chair scraped loudly against the polished marble floor, instantly drawing the attention of every single person in the room. The armed bailiff standing behind me immediately reached for his weapon, shouting a harsh command for me to sit back down. I did not move a single muscle. I locked my eyes entirely on Aaliyah. I raised my swollen, bruised hands as high as the heavy steel handcuffs would possibly allow. My knuckles were thick with severe arthritis, heavily scarred from the freezing ice water and the brutal tearing of the metal van doors the night before. Every single joint screamed in absolute burning agony as I forced my fingers to bend into the precise shapes of American Sign Language. I ignored the screaming guards. I ignored the furious pounding of the judge's heavy wooden gavel echoing through the room. The judge angrily ordered Mr. Gallagher to control his client immediately or face severe contempt charges. Gallagher calmly stood his ground, loudly informing the court that I was simply providing a legally permitted essential medical communication to a distressed minor. Heather finally broke her perfect grieving facade. She saw the immediate connection forming between us and panicked. She practically jumped out of her chair, her voice shrill and desperate, demanding the bailiffs physically remove me from the room. But I poured every ounce of my fierce, unconditional love into my ruined hands. I looked right past Heather's venomous glare and signed a single, powerful sentence directly to my trembling granddaughter. "Do not fear the dark, my son. I am standing right here in the light with you." The chaotic shouting in the courtroom seemed to fade entirely into the background. For a brief, suspended moment in time, the massive room completely disappeared. It was just an old, battered steelworker and a terrified little girl connecting across a vast ocean of trauma. Aaliyah stared intently at my moving hands. She saw the heavy steel cuffs cutting brutally into my wrists. She saw the dark purple bruises covering my face from my fight at the Oak Ridge compound. She suddenly understood the massive, terrifying physical price I had willingly paid just to be in this room with her. I had fought through monsters, armed guards, and the entire federal law enforcement system just to give her a voice. I was not going to abandon her now, and she finally realized she no longer had to face the monsters alone. The violent trembling in her tiny shoulders suddenly stopped. Aaliyah took a deep, shaky breath and slowly lowered her legs from her chest. She sat up incredibly straight in the oversized wooden chair, her small spine stiffening with a newfound undeniable courage. She turned her head slowly, completely ignoring her furious mother, and looked directly up at the towering judge. She raised her own small, bruised hands into the air. Her movements were not the clumsy, hesitant gestures of a broken child. They were sharp, precise, and flawlessly executed. She signed a formal direct request to the court. Mr. Gallagher instantly translated her movements for the shocked room. She is officially requesting the immediate presence of a state-certified American Sign Language interpreter. Gallagher announced, his voice ringing with absolute triumph. She states she is entirely ready to provide her sworn testimony. The arrogant silver-haired lawyer scrambled to his feet, shouting that the defense attorney could not act as an unbiased translator. But the judge was absolutely stunned by the profound clarity and focus in the child's eyes. The judge slammed his gavel down hard, entirely silencing the panicked defense table. He immediately ordered a neutral state-certified court interpreter to be brought into the room from the adjacent Family Services wing. 10 tense minutes later, a professional female interpreter stood next to the witness box, swearing an oath of absolute accuracy. The entire courtroom held its collective breath. For the first time in her entire 7 years of life, my beautiful granddaughter was not being treated as a defective burden or a medical liability. She was being treated as a highly credible witness in a federal court of law. The heavy silence was broken only by the swift, elegant movement of her small hands. Her voice was finally going to be heard, and it was going to tear her parents' world completely apart. The interpreter translated Aaliyah's rapid signs with a clear, steady voice that echoed devastatingly through the silent room. Aaliyah did not just cry or complain about being scared. With a chilling, analytical precision that proved her brilliant intellect, she detailed the exact timeline of her abuse. She described the heavy wooden door of the basement, The freezing temperature and the specific, cruel insults her mother had screamed at her through the wood. The judge turned incredibly pale, glaring down at Heather with absolute disgust. But Aaliyah was not finished. She smoothly transitioned from the physical torture to the hidden financial motives. Because Dion and Heather believed she was entirely mentally incompetent, they had never bothered to lower their voices when discussing their criminal plans around her. Aaliyah raised her tiny hands and quoted their private late-night conversations absolutely verbatim. She signed the exact dollar amount of the $4 million trust fund. She signed the specific names of the offshore bank accounts, and she detailed the exact legal loophole they planned to use to collect the money by warehousing her at the Oak Ridge facility. She exposed every single twisted layer of their greed. The trap was officially sprung, leaving Dion and Heather absolutely nowhere to hide. As the court interpreter's final words hung in the heavy, suffocating air of the courtroom, Heather's pristine facade completely shattered. The composed, elegant, weeping mother vanished in an absolute instant, replaced by a frantic, screaming woman cornered by her own unforgivable sins. She slammed her perfectly manicured hands flat against the heavy mahogany defense table, pushing herself up so violently that her wooden chair crashed backward onto the polished marble floor. Her voice was shrill, entirely unhinged, and completely devoid of the calculated sweetness she had used for the cameras just hours earlier. She pointed a trembling, manic finger directly at my chest, screaming at the top of her lungs to the judge that the entire testimony was a highly orchestrated, vindictive lie. She claimed I had kidnapped her severely disabled daughter, dragged her into a dirty basement, and meticulously brainwashed her. She wildly accused me of coaching a mentally defective child to memorize those complex financial terms just to destroy their perfect family and steal their hard-earned wealth. She wildly demanded that the judge strike the entire testimony from the official record, immediately arguing fiercely that a 7-year-old mute child could never possibly comprehend offshore banking or legal trust funds unless a crazy, jealous old man had forcefully drilled the script into her broken head. Dion grabbed her arm, trying desperately to pull her back into her seat, whispering frantically for her to calm down and let the lawyers handle it, but she violently shoved his hands away. Her expensive corporate lawyers were scrambling out of their chairs, desperately trying to quiet their own client, completely losing control of the narrative they had so carefully built. The entire courtroom erupted into chaotic shouting, with the armed bailiffs stepping forward, their hands resting cautiously on their duty weapons, preparing to physically restrain the wealthy mother. Mr. Gallagher did not raise his voice to interrupt her frantic meltdown. He simply stood perfectly still in the center of the courtroom, his hands casually resting in his suit pockets, letting her dig her own grave deeper and deeper with every desperate, shrieking accusation. He waited patiently for her to completely run out of breath. When she finally stopped screaming, her chest heaving heavily, Gallagher slowly turned his attention to the elevated bench. He addressed the judge with a terrifying, predatory calm. He stated that the plaintiff was absolutely correct about one specific thing. A 7-year-old child could not possibly invent this complex financial scenario, nor could she invent the hyper-specific details of the basement architecture. However, Gallagher pointed out with lethal precision, the child's sworn direct testimony now provided the exact necessary legal foundation to review the previously dismissed physical evidence. Since the child had verbally introduced the basement into the court record, the defense now had the absolute legal right to corroborate her story. He formally requested permission to play the digital hard drive, not as a primary accusation of a crime, but as direct, undeniable corroboration of the child's sworn statements under oath. The judge, his face hard as granite and clearly sickened by Heather's outburst, immediately overruled the frantic, desperate objections of the silver-haired lawyer. The judge aggressively ordered the court clerk to connect the dusty hard drive to the massive overhead monitor suspended above the jury box. The massive digital screen flickered to life, bathing the tense courtroom in a harsh, pale light. The entire room plunged into complete, suffocating silence. You could hear a pin drop on the marble floor. The video was entirely silent, recorded in stark, grainy black and white by the hidden camera I had installed 5 years ago. But the digital timestamp blinking steadily in the bottom right corner perfectly matched the exact weekend before Aaliyah was surrendered to the state transport van. The camera angle looked directly down from the exposed wooden rafters of the basement ceiling, capturing the heavy wooden storage closet perfectly in the center of the frame. For a few tense seconds, the basement was empty. Then, the heavy door at the top of the stairs violently burst open. Heather appeared on the screen. She was not wearing her elegant black designer dresses or her expensive jewelry. She wore casual, expensive athletic clothes, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unfiltered, demonic rage. She was physically dragging Aaliyah down the steep wooden stairs by her fragile, tiny arm. Aaliyah was fighting desperately, her tiny feet scrambling and slipping against the wooden steps trying to anchor herself, but Heather was simply too strong. Heather reached the bottom of the stairs and threw the little girl violently onto the hard, freezing concrete floor. Aaliyah scrambled backward in absolute terror, pressing herself tightly into the corner of the concrete wall. Heather then walked over to the wooden steps and picked up a small plastic tray holding a single piece of dry bread and a cheap plastic cup of water. She did not set it down gently for her daughter. She aggressively hauled her arm back and hurled the heavy plastic tray directly at the child's head. The tray smashed against the concrete and the plastic cup bounced violently off Aaliyah's thin shoulder, spilling cold water all over her fragile shirt. Heather pointed a furious, threatening finger right at the weeping child, her mouth moving aggressively in silent, undeniable insults that perfectly matched the cruel, horrific words Aaliyah had just signed to the court moments ago. Then the undeniable climax of her cruelty played out for the world to see. Heather grabbed the child by the shirt, shoved her roughly into the small, dark storage closet, and slammed the heavy wooden door shut with incredible force. The camera clearly captured Heather snapping the heavy metal padlock firmly into place. The video showed Heather turning her back on her weeping daughter, walking calmly back up the wooden stairs, turning off the basement lights and leaving her own flesh and blood completely trapped in the pitch-black darkness to suffer alone. A collective horrifying gasp violently ripped through the crowded courtroom. Several hardened court reporters physically covered their mouths in sheer absolute disbelief. The stark, irrefutable reality of a wealthy, privileged mother treating her own disabled child like a stray, unwanted animal was playing on a continuous, undeniable loop for the entire room to witness. There were no legal loopholes left to exploit. There were no expensive public relations spins that could erase the horrific violence captured on that screen. The judge stared intently at the massive monitor, his face completely drained of all color, his jaw tightly clenched in pure, unadulterated disgust. He slowly looked down at Heather. She was now completely frozen in her chair, staring blankly at the glowing screen as her pristine, carefully crafted public image was entirely incinerated in front of her eyes. She had no more fake tears to cry. She had no more arrogant lies to spin. Even her own high-priced, silver-haired defense attorney physically took a full deliberate step away from her at the counsel table, realizing his entire legal strategy was absolutely dead, and his own professional reputation was now completely contaminated by her evil. Dion buried his face deeply in his trembling hands, shaking uncontrollably as the sheer crushing magnitude of their exposure finally crashed down upon his shoulders. He knew instantly that they were both going to a federal prison. The judge grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down onto the sounding block with such intense, furious force that the sharp crack echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. He did not hesitate for a single second. He immediately ordered the armed court bailiffs to place both Dion and Heather under temporary maximum security court, supervised detention pending immediate federal indictments for severe child abuse, reckless endangerment, and felony fraud. I looked over at the witness box. Aaliyah was not watching the terrifying screen. She was looking directly across the room at me, a tiny, beautiful, relieved smile finally breaking through the heavy, dark shadows in her eyes. We had won the hardest battle. We had dragged the monsters completely into the light and stripped them of their power. But the silver-haired lawyer was paid an exorbitant, ridiculous amount of money to fight aggressively until his absolute last breath. Seeing his clients being handcuffed by the bailiffs, he frantically scrambled to salvage the absolute only thing his greedy clients actually cared about. He stood up nervously, adjusting his expensive silk tie, and addressed the furious judge with a sickening level of legal audacity. He formally conceded that his clients would face severe criminal consequences for their deplorable actions shown on the video. However, he quickly pivoted his argument to address the massive financial elephant sitting in the middle of the room. He loudly declared to the court that criminal child abuse charges did not automatically void a legally binding multi-million-dollar private estate trust fund. He argued with arrogant supreme confidence that the $4 million was completely protected by ironclad bloodline inheritance laws established by Heather's late father. He stated clearly that even if Dion and Heather were officially declared terrible abusive parents and sent away to federal prison, the money was legally tied to their biological status as the primary guardians at the exact time the trust was originally created. He smirked maliciously at me across the aisle, his voice dripping with pure corporate greed. He declared openly that I might have successfully manipulated the court into granting me physical custody of a broken, traumatized child, but I would absolutely never be allowed to touch a single solitary penny of their family money. The lawyer's arrogant smile widened as he proudly proclaimed that the wealth still belonged entirely to them and the law absolutely protected their money above all else. The arrogant proclamation of the silver-haired defense attorney echoed through the cavernous courtroom, dripping with the absolute certainty of a man who believed wealth could conquer any consequence. He stood tall, adjusting his silk tie, fully expecting us to crumble under the heavy weight of corporate estate law. He believed he had successfully salvaged the $4 million prize for his wicked clients. But Mr. Gallagher did not look defeated. Instead, a slow, incredibly sharp smile spread across his face. It was the exact smile of a seasoned predator watching its prey willingly step directly into a meticulously placed steel trap. The moment I had been waiting for, the silent adjustment of power I had promised myself when they first threw me out of their driveway, had finally arrived. Gallagher calmly adjusted his jacket and looked directly at the smug defense attorney. He stated that the defense fundamentally misunderstood the profound intelligence of the man who actually built that wealth. Gallagher formally called his final unannounced witness to the stand. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the room opened once again, and an older, distinguished gentleman wearing a conservative tweed suit walked down the aisle. He carried a heavy locked leather briefcase. He introduced himself to the court as Arthur Pendleton, the senior managing director of the elite financial firm entrusted with the absolute execution of the late family estate. Heather physically recoiled in her chair when she heard the name. Arthur was her late father's oldest, most trusted friend, and the sole executor of the massive trust fund. Mr. Pendleton took the oath and sat rigidly in the witness box. He did not offer Heather a single glance of comfort. His eyes held only the cold, strict professionalism of a man sworn to protect a dead friend's final wishes. Gallagher approached the stand and asked him to clarify the exact binding legal terms of the multi-million-dollar trust fund that the defense attorney was so aggressively trying to claim. Mr. Pendleton placed his heavy leather briefcase on the wooden ledge, unlocked the brass clasps with a sharp click, and pulled out a thick stack of original watermarked legal documents. He explained to the silent courtroom that Heather's father was an incredibly shrewd businessman who possessed zero illusions regarding the deeply flawed moral character of his own daughter. He knew her insatiable greed. He knew her absolute lack of maternal empathy. The old man was terrified that Heather would eventually find a dark loophole to drain the account and leave his beloved granddaughter completely destitute. So he hired a team of the most ruthless estate lawyers in the country to draft a highly specific, inescapable contingency plan. Mr. Pendleton adjusted his reading glasses and turned to the second page of the heavy document. Gallagher asked him to read Section 4, Paragraph B aloud for the official court record. The silver-haired defense attorney instantly jumped up, shouting an objection, claiming this was a complete waste of judicial time since bloodline laws automatically superseded private contracts. The judge slammed his gavel, ordering the lawyer to sit down and be completely silent, absolutely captivated by the financial executor. Mr. Pendleton cleared his throat and began to read the dense, heavily fortified legal jargon. He explained that the trust was indeed designed to pay out $4 million on Aaliyah's 10th birthday, provided she remained under the guardianship of her biological parents. However, the father had anticipated that Heather might try to offload the child to a cheap facility to avoid doing the actual work of parenting. The document contained a hidden, absolute poison pill clause explicitly designed to trigger total financial ruin if Heather ever attempted to abandon her responsibilities. Heather was staring at Mr. Pendleton with her mouth slightly open, a cold sweat breaking out across her forehead as she suddenly realized she had completely underestimated her dead father. She had spent the last 5 years blindly believing the money was her absolute birthright, completely unaware that a meticulously engineered financial trap had been sitting silently underneath her feet the entire time. The entire courtroom held its breath as Mr. Pendleton read the fatal clause. The document clearly stated that if the biological parents voluntarily surrender legal custody of the minor child to any state or federal welfare system for any medical or personal reason, for even a single 24-hour period, they instantly and permanently forfeit all rights to the trust. The financial executor looked up from the heavy paper and stared directly at Heather. He explained that by legally signing Aaliyah away to the Department of Child and Family Services to avoid taking care of her, Heather had actively triggered the poison pill. She had legally stripped herself of the $4 million the exact second her pen touched the state surrender forms. The silver-haired lawyer frantically flipped through his own digital copies of the trust, his face turning an alarming shade of gray, as he finally found the hidden paragraph he had completely missed in his arrogant haste. Gallagher did not let the momentum stop. He asked Mr. Pendleton what happens to the massive financial asset once the biological parents forfeit their rights. Mr. Pendleton read the final sentence of the clause. The entire $4 million trust, along with all accumulated interest, transfers immediately and irrevocably to the next court-appointed legal guardian of the minor child. The judge looked down from the bench, a genuine smile finally touching the corners of his tired mouth. He raised his heavy gavel and formally declared that as of this exact moment, considering the horrific abuse displayed on the video, I was granted full permanent physical and legal custody of my granddaughter. Therefore, I was now the sole legal controller of the $4 million estate. The defense attorney's arrogant boast had completely backfired. Heather and Dion had tortured a child and destroyed their entire family for absolutely nothing. They were walking away entirely broke. The absolute reality of their total financial annihilation hit the defense table like a physical bomb. Dion sat completely paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing, as his brain struggled to process the devastating fact that the massive fortune he had banked his entire future on was officially gone forever. He looked at Heather, the woman he had abandoned his own daughter for the woman who had promised him endless wealth and high society status. The wealthy, composed businessman facade completely vanished. Pure, unfiltered panic and rage violently erupted from his chest. Dion suddenly leaped out of his chair, lunging aggressively toward his wife right in the middle of the crowded courtroom. He grabbed Heather by the shoulders of her expensive black dress, shaking her violently as he screamed at the top of his lungs. He roared that the basement torture was entirely her idea. He shrieked that she was the one who contacted Dr. Vance and orchestrated the horrific chemical abuse to illegally secure the trust fund. He frantically threw her entirely under the bus, completely betraying her in front of the judge, desperately hoping to save himself from a heavy federal prison sentence by pinning the entire mastermind operation directly onto his wife. The courtroom exploded into absolute chaos as the armed bailiffs rushed the defense table to tear the screaming wealthy couple apart. The physical altercation between Dion and Heather escalated with terrifying speed. Heather did not cower when her husband lunged at her. Instead, a feral, cornered desperation took over her entirely. She raised her hands, her perfectly manicured nails transforming into actual weapons, and slashed violently across Dion's face. Deep red scratches instantly appeared on his cheek, bleeding onto his crisp white collar. He stumbled backward, shouting in pain, but Heather launched her entire body at him. She tackled him against the heavy wooden defense table, sending legal briefs, water pitchers, and expensive fountain pens crashing to the marble floor in a chaotic shower of debris. The two armed bailiffs sprinted across the room, shouting aggressive commands, but the sheer adrenaline pumping through the wealthy couple made them incredibly difficult to pull apart. As the officers physically wrestled them to the ground, pinning their arms behind their backs, the real destruction began. In their absolute blind rage, completely forgetting they were in a federal courtroom with a stenographer recording every single sound, they began weaponizing their darkest secrets against each other. Heather thrashed against the heavy knee of the bailiff, pinning her to the floor, and screamed at the top of her lungs. She shrieked that she was not going to take the fall alone while Dion hid his stolen money. She loudly confessed to the entire room that Dion had been systematically committing massive corporate tax fraud for the past 3 years. She screamed the exact names of the offshore shell companies he used to hide his assets from the IRS. She yelled that Dion was the one who negotiated the corrupt bribery payments with Dr. Vance, intentionally classifying the illegal payoffs as legitimate business consulting expenses to secure tax deductions while their daughter suffered in a chemical coma. Dion, his face pressed hard against the cold marble floor by the second bailiff, spat blood from his busted lip and roared right back at her. He completely abandoned any remaining shred of his dignified public persona. He yelled that Heather was the one who forged Aaliyah's medical evaluations to legally classify the child as an unmanageable burden. He screamed that she had bribed a private psychiatrist thousands of dollars to sign the falsified state surrender documents without ever actually examining the child. They were literally handing the federal government a meticulously detailed, fully confessed roadmap to their entire criminal enterprise. The expensive corporate defense attorneys stood completely frozen in horror, their mouths hanging open, watching their own clients verbally secure decades in federal prison without a single prosecutor having to ask a question. The sheer stupidity born of their absolute greed was breathtaking. The judge had heard entirely enough. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down onto the sounding block with a rapid, thunderous succession of strikes that echoed like artillery fire in the massive room. He roared for absolute silence, his voice booming with the full, terrifying authority of the federal bench. The bailiffs finally managed to lock heavy steel handcuffs onto both Dion and Heather's wrists, dragging them roughly to their feet. They stood there breathing heavily, their designer clothes torn and ruined, finally realizing the catastrophic magnitude of what they had just confessed on the official court record. The judge leaned over his elevated bench, staring down at them with a disgust so profound it seemed to lower the temperature in the room. He stated clearly that in his 30 years presiding over family and criminal law, he had never witnessed such a repulsive, sociopathic display of parental cruelty and absolute financial depravity. He did not ask for further closing arguments. He did not need to deliberate. The judge formally declared his immediate, irrevocable ruling. He permanently terminated every single parental right Dion and Heather possessed regarding Aaliyah, legally severing them from the child forever. He signed the emergency decree granting me full, uncontested physical and legal custody of my granddaughter, effectively and permanently transferring the absolute control of the $4 million trust fund directly into my name. But the judge was not finished. He looked directly at the armed bailiffs and ordered them to immediately remand both Dion and Heather into maximum security federal custody without the possibility of bail. He officially instructed the court clerk to forward the newly acquired video evidence along with the verbatim transcript of their screaming financial confessions directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. Dion and Heather were physically dragged out of the courtroom in heavy iron chains. They did not look back. They did not ask about their daughter. They only wept for themselves and the massive fortune they had just lost forever. As the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, sealing their fate, the chaotic energy in the courtroom rapidly drained away. Mr. Gallagher stood beside me, quietly packing his legal documents into his leather briefcase with a satisfied, predatory smile. I did not cheer. I did not gloat over the destruction of my only son. I felt a profound, heavy sorrow for the boy I had raised, but an even greater, overwhelming relief that the monster he had become could never hurt my family again. I walked past the scattered debris of the defense table and approached the wooden witness box. Aaliyah was sitting quietly watching me with her beautiful dark eyes. I did not care about my bruised, aching joints or the exhaustion deep in my bones. I reached down, scooped her tiny, fragile body up into my arms and held her tightly against my chest. She wrapped her small arms securely around my neck and rested her head on my shoulder. We walked out of that federal courthouse together, stepping out into the bright, warm afternoon sunlight. We had won the most impossible battle of our lives. But as I held her in the safety of the daylight, a cold, dark shadow still lingered in the back of my mind. We were safe, and we were suddenly incredibly wealthy, but the monstrous facility that had facilitated her torture was still standing. Oak Ridge Private Care was still operating, and Dr. Vance was still collecting his bloody paychecks. My mission was not completely over. A few weeks passed, bringing a profound, healing quiet to our lives. We had temporarily relocated to a beautiful, highly secure rental home on the edge of the city, far away from the dark memories of the industrial sector and the wealthy suburbs. The $4 million trust fund had been completely unfrozen and fully transferred under my direct legal control. For the first time in my entire life, money was absolutely no object. I did not have to worry about the cost of groceries, the price of heating oil, or the staggering medical bills my granddaughter deserved. But while Aaliyah was finally sleeping peacefully in a warm, comfortable bed, the horrific memories of that concrete compound haunted my own dreams. I knew that dozens of other silent, defenseless children were still locked behind those heavy metal doors, suffering under the same chemical haze that had almost erased my granddaughter. I called Mr. Gallagher to the house. We sat in the bright, sunlit kitchen, drinking black coffee. I slid a heavy folder containing Dr. Vance's name across the marble counter. I told Gallagher that simply rescuing Aaliyah was not enough. I wanted to burn Oak Ridge Private Care to the ground, and I was entirely willing to spend every single penny of the trust fund to do it. Gallagher smiled that same terrifying, predatory smile I had seen in the courtroom. He told me we did not need to drain the trust fund. We were going to make the state and the corrupt corporation pay for their own destruction. Utilizing the undeniable video evidence from the basement the financial ledgers Silas had hacked and Aaliyah's flawless certified testimony, Gallagher launched a massive, devastating class action civil rights lawsuit against both the state welfare department and the corporate entity that owned Oak Ridge. He did not quietly file the paperwork in a back office. He unleashed a highly coordinated, aggressive media blitz. He handed copies of the bribed financial records to the most ruthless investigative journalists in the country. Within 48 hours, Oak Ridge was the absolute center of a massive national scandal. News helicopters continuously circled the bleak concrete compound. Furious crowds of protesters gathered outside the chain-link fences, demanding immediate accountability. Dr. Vance panicked entirely. He arrogantly believed his political connections within the state government would protect him, but the sheer velocity and magnitude of Gallagher's legal assault completely overwhelmed his defenses. Vance desperately attempted to order his remaining medical staff to physically destroy thousands of internal medical records and wipe the facility hard drives to hide the evidence of their systemic chemical abuse. But Gallagher had already anticipated his exact move. Before Vance could even light a match, Gallagher successfully secured an emergency federal injunction. A massive convoy of black tactical vehicles belonging to the Federal Bureau of Investigation violently breached the front gates of Oak Ridge. Heavily armed federal agents stormed the corridors, completely seizing the entire compound. They confiscated every single computer, locked down the pharmacy where the heavy sedatives were kept, and physically escorted the terrified medical staff out of the building. The fallout was absolute and totally uncompromising. Dr. Vance was arrested in his lavish office, paraded out of the facility in heavy handcuffs under the glaring lights of dozens of news cameras. He was subsequently indicted on over 50 federal counts of child abuse, massive medical fraud, and conspiracy, virtually guaranteeing he would spend the rest of his natural life rotting in a maximum security penitentiary. The corrupt state caseworkers who had blindly approved the transfers to Oak Ridge were immediately terminated and faced their own severe criminal charges for extreme criminal negligence. But the most important beautiful victory was the liberation of the children. The state was forced to completely dismantle the facility. Dozens of disabled, neglected children were carefully evacuated from that dark prison. Backed by the massive financial pressure of our lawsuit, the state was legally compelled to relocate every single child into highly vetted, properly funded, and deeply compassionate medical sanctuaries. The fortress of cruelty was permanently boarded up, left to decay into nothing but a dark memory. With the corrupt system completely destroyed and the monsters locked away in concrete cells, the heavy, suffocating storm that had consumed our lives finally broke. The dust settled, revealing a bright, incredibly hopeful future. I purchased a beautiful, sprawling home in a quiet, welcoming community with a massive backyard where Aaliyah could safely run and play in the sun. But the greatest transformation was not the house or the money. It was the healing of her voice. Using the extensive resources of the trust fund, I hired the most brilliant, patient, and compassionate specialized speech and trauma therapists in the entire country. They came to our home every single day. They did not force her. They did not rush her. They worked with her through gentle play, using advanced American Sign Language and supportive physical therapies to help her overcome the severe psychological damage inflicted by her parents. Months later, I was sitting in my comfortable armchair by the large living room window, watching the autumn leaves fall across the green lawn. My hands still ached with the familiar burn of arthritis, but my heart was completely at peace. Aaliyah came running into the room holding a brightly colored drawing she had just finished. She bounded up to my chair, a massive, genuine smile lighting up her beautiful face. She did not use her hands to communicate this time. She looked directly into my eyes, took a deep breath, and using a soft, fragile, but incredibly clear voice, she spoke her very first words to me since the nightmare began. She simply said, "I love you, Grandpa." Hearing that beautiful sound, a sound her parents had cruelly labeled as defective and impossible, was the absolute greatest victory of my entire life. They thought her silence was a weakness they could easily exploit for their own greed. They thought my age made me blind and helpless. But they forgot one simple, undeniable truth. The most devastating storms do not arrive with a loud scream. They build quietly in the absolute silence, and when they finally break, they wash away all the darkness, leaving only love behind. 3 years have passed since the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse closed on the darkest chapter of our lives. The transition from survival to genuine peace was not immediate, but time and absolute safety have a miraculous way of healing even the deepest, most agonizing wounds. Today, the sterile white walls and blinding fluorescent lights of Oak Ridge are nothing but a distant, fading nightmare. We live in a beautiful, sprawling ranch-style home nestled at the end of a quiet, tree-lined cul-de-sac. The property boasts a massive, vibrant backyard garden that I cultivate entirely myself. My arthritic knees still complain bitterly when the weather turns damp, but kneeling in the rich, dark soil to plant purple hydrangeas and bright yellow sunflowers brings a profound, undeniable peace to my soul. Aaliyah absolutely loves the garden. She spends hours running barefoot across the soft green grass, chasing butterflies and reading thick paperback books under the massive shade of an old oak tree. The heavy, terrified silence that once suffocated her spirit has been completely replaced by the joyful, vibrant energy of a child who finally knows she is unconditionally loved. We built an impenetrable fortress of safety, funded by the very trust fund her parents tried to steal, and inside these walls, she has blossomed into something truly extraordinary. I sat in the front row of the grand auditorium at the Oakwood Academy for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing wearing my absolute best Sunday suit. The massive auditorium was packed to the brim with proud parents and esteemed faculty members. The stage lights beamed down brightly, illuminating the polished wooden floor. I looked down at my hands, resting peacefully on my lap. The thick, heavy scars from the factory, the deep, permanent physical damage I inflicted upon myself, tearing open that armored transport van, and the crooked, swollen joints from forcing myself to learn sign language in freezing ice water were all still there. They were the permanent physical receipts of the brutal war I fought for her. But today, they did not ache. Today, they were completely at rest. The heavy velvet curtains pulled back and Aaliyah stepped confidently up to the center podium. She was 10 years old now, standing tall and incredibly poised in a crisp white blouse and a dark pleated skirt. There was absolutely no trace of the trembling, heavily sedated little girl locked in a concrete room. Her dark eyes were sharp, highly intelligent, and completely fearless. She looked out over the massive crowd and smiled beautifully. She raised her hands and began her final academic presentation. Her American Sign Language was breathtaking. It was a fluid, elegant, and incredibly powerful dance of expression. She presented a complex science project on the migratory patterns of monarch butterflies, her fingers fluttering with the exact same delicate grace we used to practice on the front porch so many years ago. She commanded the entire room with an undeniable magnetic authority. The audience was absolutely captivated by her brilliant mind. As I watched her sign, my chest swelled with a pride so massive it threatened to break my ribs all over again. She had not merely survived the horrific trauma her parents inflicted upon her. She had completely conquered it. She was thriving, was entirely empowered by her own voice, proving to the entire world that she was never a defective product. She was an absolute masterpiece. Later that afternoon, we returned to the quiet, warm sanctuary of our home. While Aaliyah went straight out to the garden to check on the progress of her tall sunflowers, I walked to the front porch to collect the daily mail. Hidden among the colorful catalogs and routine utility bills was a cheap, thin white envelope stamped heavily with the stark, unmistakable red ink of the federal penitentiary system. I walked into the living room, sat heavily in my leather armchair by the stone fireplace, and tore the envelope open. It was a handwritten letter from Dion. 3 agonizing years in a maximum security federal prison had clearly stripped away his expensive custom suits and his arrogant superiority. The letter was a pathetic, frantic ramble. He wrote page after page begging for my absolute forgiveness, desperately trying to blame Heather for every single terrible decision they ever made. He complained bitterly about the brutal, isolating conditions of his confinement and, completely predictably, begged me to release a few $1,000s from the trust fund to pay for a new, high-priced appeals lawyer. He swore up and down that he was a completely changed man and just wanted the opportunity to be a real father again. I read the desperate, manipulative words carefully, feeling absolutely nothing. There was no anger left in my heart, but there was also absolutely zero mercy. I did not write him back. I did not call my lawyer to report the contact. I simply stood up, walked over to the stone fireplace, and struck a single wooden match. I held the corner of the cheap prison paper over the small orange flame and watched calmly as the edges curled and blackened. I dropped the burning letter onto the heavy iron grate, standing quietly as the lying words of the monster who tried to destroy my granddaughter were entirely reduced to a pile of gray, weightless ash. They thought her silence was a weakness they could exploit. They thought my age made me blind. But they forgot one simple truth: the most devastating storms don't arrive with a scream. They build in the silence. I also learned that silence is never empty. Society and even our own blood often mistake a lack of spoken words for a lack of intelligence. They looked at Aaliyah and saw a medical burden they could easily dismiss simply because she could not shout back. But true strength requires the absolute patience to listen differently. When you take the time to learn the unique language of someone who has been discarded by the world, you do not just give them a voice. You uncover a profound truth that can bring down empires. Never underestimate the quiet ones in the room. If you believe that every child deserves a champion to fight for them when the world refuses to listen, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of justice.